Yesterday I was sitting, recalling, reminiscing, trying to remember whenever there was nobody listening. Before the hugging and the kissing, the booing and the hissing, all I had was just a vision, all I had was my ambition. Your love without condition kept me swinging when the mission. My eyes upon the prize kept me striving for the mission. When I was down for the count, falling out of commission, I can hear your voice now screaming out, son, listen, get on up, don't give up. Know you struck opposition, time to buck all that stuff. Find out what's your condition, like a pull in my soul, like keys in my ignition. Call you all my commission, my love and my vision. And doesn't matter if you call me wrong, doesn't matter if you steal my soul, doesn't matter if we're all alone, it doesn't matter at all. I would take a bullet for you, I would take a bullet for you. I'm across any line, I swim across the sea. I would take a bullet for you, I would take a bullet for you. I would lose it all and take my fall to show you it's for real. It's for real. Remember when we used to flow together back in the park? You would sling guitar licks on the stars in the dark. You say let's grow together as this world falls apart. I was holding on to hope but hardly holding the spark. All the rhymes that I wrote you called dope from the start. It'd be like a pure note, like a quote on the mark. You'd go to every show and promote from the start. From the beginning we've been building much more than this art. Remember bearing scars in your car to impart your heart. You cared enough to call my bluff through the jump from the start. That's why you're holding on to half of my heart. You've been there through the times, through the nights that were dark. And doesn't matter if you call me wrong, doesn't matter if you steal my soul, doesn't matter if we're all alone, it doesn't matter at all. 'Cause I would take a bullet for you, I would take a bullet for you. I'm across any line, I swim across the sea. I would take a bullet for you, I would take a bullet for you. I would lose it all and take my fall to show you it's for real. It's for real. It's for real. Doesn't matter if they call me wrong, doesn't matter if they steal my song, doesn't matter if we're all alone, it doesn't matter at all. Doesn't matter if they call me wrong, doesn't matter if they steal my song.
9.
Oh yeah, it's supposed to start at 9.
Yes,
It just seems like no one.
I know. This happens,
Yeah.
you know.
They sign up and then they don't show up.
Right, well, there's always that, and then of course, yes, anytime's fine.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Marshall, and I'm the Vice President for the Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity here at the Heritage Foundation. And I want to thank you all for being here today. It is my pleasure to kick things off this morning by welcoming Americans United for Life to the Heritage Foundation to host their Women Speak 2018 Symposium. You are going to hear from some extraordinary women here today. They are legal, economic, medical, and cultural experts who have reflected deeply on issues surrounding the protection of human life and human flourishing, especially women's well-being and opportunity. I've had the pleasure of teaming up with several of them in the past, and so it's very fun to be reunited. I think very highly of the work of many of those who you'll be hearing from today. Over the past few years at the Heritage Foundation, we produced an annual index of culture and opportunity. Each year we looked at several dozen indicators of culture to see if they were trending in a way that would open the path to opportunity for more Americans or stand in their way of progressing. We looked at things like the marriage rate, unwed childbearing, teen drug use, welfare dependence, education outcomes. And when we took a look at these trends each year, most indicators showed bad news, or at the very best, tenuous good news. The one very clear exception was the abortion rate, which consistently declined each year. The progress on life was the one constant and unequivocal piece of great news in each year's index. Not only is the abortion rate at its lowest level since before Roe v. Wade, but public opinion has trended towards life. A record number of state pro-life laws have been enacted in recent years. Technology continues to advance in ways that both sustain life and increase support for life. And the creativity, optimism, energy, and usefulness of the broad pro-life movement, it just continues to grow and to grow. These are reasons for great encouragement. As a pro-life movement, together we seek the holistic flourishing of women, of children, of all members of society. And we call on the many more Americans who are earnestly seeking the welfare of their neighbors to join us in striving for a society where every child is protected in law and welcomed in life. Commitment to the welfare of our neighbors requires us to stand up for them when they are most vulnerable, including the beginning and the end of life. To that purpose, we are proud to stand with Americans United for Life and the other pro-life individuals and institutions represented here today. Please join me in welcoming the president of Americans United for Life, Catherine Glenn Foster, to open today's program.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to Heritage for co-hosting and welcoming everyone here to their offices today. We truly appreciate your good work and all that you are doing for life. We welcome also all of our guests, both in person and online. We welcome our stellar panelists, and we thank them for leading this discussion that we expect to be very productive and very inspiring. And we thank our sponsors for making today possible. Sponsors including Dr. Eugene and Rosemary Diamond, the Justice Foundation, Operation Outcry, and our anonymous supporters. Americans United for Life is the nation's leading pro-life legal team, formed 2 years before Roe v. Wade, and we have been involved in every Supreme Court case since and including Roe. We work in the legislatures, the courts, and the culture toward that day when every human being is welcomed in life and protected in law. The question that I am most asked about this event here today, Women Speak 2018, is why now? Why 2018? AUL's legal strategists have been tracking the trends, the law, and the culture for decades. And we know that now is the time for this very timely dialogue because we now have new opportunities for overturning Roe. We have seen women's lives improve in the recent decades, and we have seen that Roe is now out of date. The latest Gallup poll, released just 2 days ago, revealed that 48% of Americans identify as pro-life and 48% as pro-choice. Now, that is a dramatic change from the mid-1990s. We have seen the pro-choice side of things drop by 8%, while the people who identify as pro-life, that number has skyrocketed by 15%. Then when you take a step back and you take away those more politically loaded terms pro-life and pro-choice, we see that 48% of Americans believe that abortion is morally wrong and only 43% believe that abortion is morally acceptable, a difference of 5%. And then taking another step back, we see that 53% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in no or only a few circumstances. As Jennifer mentioned, abortion is one of only limited cultural issues, moral issues, about which Americans' views have not become more liberal over the last few decades. In fact, they have become more conservative, more life-affirming. We have seen the abortion rate. It has fallen nearly 50% in nearly over a decade to the lowest rate since before Roe, and we have similarly seen the number of abortion clinics falling. States are working hard to protect women and girls from abortion, and yet they have seen their efforts stymied, for example, in Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt. But nonetheless, we have seen progress. In those first years after Roe v. Wade voided nearly every state law on abortion, states started trying to enact these common sense regulations. In the first 10 years after Roe, from 1973 to 1983, states averaged 38 pro-life bills signed into law every year, primarily health and safety standards, parental involvement, gestational limits, and critical conscience rights. Over the next 28 years, we saw a slowdown. From 1983 to 2010, the states passed 406 pro-life laws, an average of 14 each year, focusing on giving women the time that they need to make this critical decision, and partial birth abortion limits. But since January 2011, the states have passed 423 pro-life bills into law, such as full informed consent for women and girls considering abortion, parental involvement, chemical abortion limits, taxpayer funding restrictions, and gestational limits. Since 2011, we have seen an average of almost 60 new pro-life laws every single year, more than a third in the entire time since Roe v. Wade. In total now, 48 states have passed laws to affirm and protect healthcare rights of conscience. 40 states have enforceable parental involvement laws. 40 states limit abortion practice to physicians only. 38 states have fetal homicide laws, 30 from conception, and 41 allow for civil suits for the wrongful death of an unborn child. 29 states have enforceable abortion clinic regulations. 24 states have ultrasound requirements. 32 states and the District of Columbia follow the federal taxpayer funding limitations of the Hyde Amendment, which Americans United for Life defended before the United States Supreme Court, and which has been estimated to have saved over 2 million lives. Yet in 1992, the Supreme Court, in the Planned Parenthood v. Casey case, they said, for 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. The ability of women, they said, to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. The Constitution serves human values, and while the effective reliance on Roe cannot be exactly measured, neither can the certain cost of overturning Roe for people who have ordered their thinking and living around that case be dismissed. To imagine women's lives without Roe, we have to refute the reliance interest, that doctrine that was concocted by the U.S. Supreme Court, and we have to explore the cultural and political paradigms that argue that abortion is necessary for women's advancement. 3 panels today will address the core issues. A legal panel discussing what overturning Roe will and won't mean for women, for the law, both state and federal legislation. A medical panel looking at the unexplored benefits of what more limited abortion will mean for the health of women, for children, and for families, as well as the often neglected risks of abortion. And a cultural panel examining the implications for children and the cultural philosophy, what the data doesn't tell us about the workforce implications for women and the media. We are looking forward to today's conversation. Now is the time to re-envision women's lives after Roe and to chart the best paths forward for our families, our laws, our healthcare, and our legal system. Without further ado, let's kick off the program. Our first panel of speakers will address the legal implications of life after Roe. Leading off the discussion is Erica Bacchiacchi, scrutinizing the reliance interest arguments. She is a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School and a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Next, we'll hear from Lynn Combe, professor of family law at Regent University School of Law, on the repercussions of Roe to families and relationships. And closing out the legal panel is Solicitor General of the Louisiana Department of Justice, Liz Murrell, who will discuss the litigation environment post-Women's Health v. Hellerstedt and the court cases in Louisiana and elsewhere that may present the Supreme Court with an opportunity to revisit Roe. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you, Catherine. So in my brief remarks this morning, I'd like to revisit Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the decision that, of course, reaffirmed Roe in 1992 and is still the law of the land today. As you'll probably remember, Casey reaffirmed Roe not because the justices in Casey thought Roe was rightly decided as an original matter, as they tell us more than once in the opinion, but rather because the justices in the Casey plurality assumed that the country, over the intervening 19 years, had come to rely upon the right bestowed in Roe as a centerpiece of women's liberty and equality, whatever the Constitution said or didn't say about the matter. That's the reliance interest Catherine was referring to. My argument this morning, which is drawn from a law review article just out, which you can find in Quinnipiac Law Journal, will be that in doubling down on Roe in this way, Casey put the weight of the court's authority on a particularly inhumane way of securing women's equal status in society, and thus debilitated efforts to more authentically respond to women's disproportionate role in reproduction ever since. In a word, if you wonder why we still don't have good work-family policy, you can blame Casey and Roe. As Catherine noted, the Casey plurality writes, and I'm going to quote this again because it's kind of the key language that we'll all be sort of looking at today. For 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. Now, there are 2 claims being made here. One as regards the interplay of abortion and contraception, the other as regards women's equal participation in economic and social life. I'm going to look at each quickly in turn. So as a descriptive account, I think the first, concerning intimate relationships, is quite accurate. From 1973 onward, people had organized intimate relationships in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. This seems like an apt description of the sexual revolution. Reliance upon abortion is very much at work in contexts where abortion is readily available, as it had been made in Roe. But the reliance effect of readily available abortion, if studied over time, is more far-reaching and corrosive than the court here presumes. Indeed, the reliance upon abortion is less notable as a remedy for contraceptive failure in individual cases, which is the court's assumption. Easy abortion access is far more notable, according to economists, for its moral hazard effect, for inspiring a large-scale, societal-wide increase in sexual risk-taking on the part of sexual actors. Rather than merely offer a practical fail-safe in the event of a contraceptive failure, easy abortion access has actually been shown to disincentivize contraceptive use and thus lead to more abortion. Here's Richard Posner in 1994 describing the sort of unintended consequences here. Quote, "If abortion is cheap, intercourse will be more frequent and may generate more unwanted pregnancies, not all of which will be aborted. This should help us to understand the combinations of cheap contraceptives, frequent abortions, and yet a high rate of unwanted births in our society," end quote. Notably, the rate of non-marital births has increased most significantly over the last several decades among poor women, for whom the attitudinal decoupling of sex and childbearing and marriage ushered in by this new sexual insurance policy has been most acute. Now, were abortion less readily accessible or more costly, economists suggest that contraceptive use and greater avoidance of sexual intercourse would increase, and that both the abortion rate and unintended pregnancies would likely decrease, though never to a vanishing point, of course. Interestingly, recent data, as Catherine noted, has shown a significant decrease in the abortion rate over the last several years. So here's my hypothesis. Modest restrictions on abortion have made abortion a bit more costly, and therefore create incentives toward more responsible sexual activity, including more contraceptive use and greater avoidance of sexual intercourse, both of which have also been reported recently. So this descriptively accurate account of reliance upon abortion in intimate relationships is entirely question-begging as a prescriptive matter. That is, could such a reordering of thinking around abortion, such a reliance upon abortion, have actually had a distortive, detrimental effect upon society, upon women? One could well argue that in practice, the sexual insurance policy putatively taken out to insure both sexes against childbearing, in reality, insures primarily men, leaving women, especially poor women, worse off. Not only have sexual norms shifted away from the higher commitment sex that research continues to indicate is preferred by most women, but the increased rates of unexpected pregnancy, non-marital births, and abortion that accompanied the new sexual ethic over the last several decades disproportionately impact women. The now common mentality that sex has no consequences and thus entails no responsibilities often leaves women alone with their pregnancies to procure abortions or rear their children on their own, both of which portend great and various harms in themselves, especially among the poor. But the court is not only interested in how people have organized intimate relationships. Moving on to the second claim, the ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. The plurality opinion in Casey cites as authority for this proposition a book entitled Abortion and Women's Choice by Rosalind Pollock-Pachetsky. The page of the book referenced by the Casey court falls in a chapter that discusses the correlation between women's decreased rates of fertility with women's increased rates of education and employment, especially in the decades prior to Roe, during and after the Second World War. Such a correlation is unsurprising and uncontroversial, and the author is good to point out that the causal relationship between the two is uncertain. That is, do women work more when they have fewer children, or do women have fewer children when they work more? But importantly, the Casey court is not simply making a claim about women's decreased rates of fertility. It is making a claim specifically about abortion. That is, in declaring in a case concerning abortion that women's participation in social and economic life is facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives, the court is making the much more specific claim that abortion is necessary for such participation. But Pachetsky does not say this. Instead, she hypothesizes, notes the complexity of the data she is discussing, and even that such data is not subject to generalization. But generalize is exactly what the court does. And so in grounding, it's a reaffirmation of a decision it thinks was likely wrongly decided as an original matter. The Casey court relies on a generalization unsupported by the very reference it cites. That is, even if lower fertility rates do lead to higher rates of education and employment, or vice versa, the court does not offer any evidence that abortion, rather than, for instance, fertility regulation of various kinds, is specifically correlated with higher rates of education and employment. To date, we still have no such evidence, despite anecdotal accounts in recent amicus briefs proclaiming things like, "I'm an attorney because I had an abortion." In fact, evidence points more readily to both state and congressional initiatives in support of women's equal opportunity in the workplace, as well as the many anti-discrimination cases won at the High Court since the 1970s. So putting aside the court's lack of evidence for its broad claim, and even assuming, just for the sake of argument, that women's equal participation in economic and social life is an appropriate proxy for gender equality, an assumption I would dispute, the joint opinion's further assumption that abortion is necessary for such equality could be construed instead as deeply misogynist. The equality argument for abortion rights rests upon a peculiar 1970s feminist philosophy that reduces sexual equality to sameness, setting up the male body as the norm. The equality argument suggests that just as men can physiologically avoid the reproductive potential of sexual intercourse, men's bodies do not experience the consequences of fertility within them, so too should women be enabled. As Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe writes, quote, "While men retain the right to sexual and reproductive autonomy, restrictions on abortion deny that autonomy to women," end quote. But it is not abortion restrictions that deny autonomy to women. The state of pregnancy itself exhibits the embodied reality that when pregnant, a woman is not autonomous. She is carrying a new, albeit dependent and vulnerable human being within her. Thus, unlike a man who has fathered a child, a pregnant woman cannot simply walk away. No, to approach the desired autonomy of the child-abandoning man, a pregnant woman must engage in a life-destroying act. Relying on abortion to facilitate gender equality, then, is seeking a kind of faux equality for women by way of imitation of men, and not very good men, as many before me have pointed out. Instead of insisting upon cultural acceptance of the distinctive reproductive capacity of women and cultural respect and support for the caregiving women still disproportionately undertake, 1970s feminism seeks to facilitate gender equality through legitimating violence against nascent, dependent children to whom their mothers and their fathers and society at large properly owe duties of care. It may be that when the Casey court suggests that, quote, "an entire generation has come of age free to assume Roe's concept of liberty in defining the capacity of women to act in society," it is, again, descriptively accurate. When the Casey court doubled down on the constitutional right to abortion, employers and other public institutions remained free to be unchanged by women's participation in them. But what if instead Smart and talented women and men led our profit-driven culture to understand that all working persons are or ought to be deeply encumbered by their prior obligations to their families and to the dependent and vulnerable at large. That is, without Roe, and with the women's movement's commendable wins in sex discrimination cases in the 1970s, workplaces would have had to adjust much more quickly to encumbered women and duly encumbered men, and so the demands of the family more generally. It would surely be difficult for an older generation of feminists to imagine a women's movement without Roe. These feminists remember a time when women were regarded as solely designed for domestic life, when women's opinions were undervalued, and when mothers were seen as more capable and essential to their children's upbringings than were fathers. For these older feminists, restrictions upon abortion betray precisely that vision of women, one which unfairly confines women solely to maternity, with no respect for their contributions beyond. This 1970s feminist fear is what the Casey plurality seems to be responding to. But for those of us who grew up with the anti-discrimination gains of the 1970s securely in place, there is no question that women are as capable of educational and professional achievement as men. The questions have now become why the essential work of caring for dependents, still undertaken and valued disproportionately by women, is not as esteemed and accommodated as it should be, and why poor women continue to be bereft of the paternal support both they and their children so heartily need. It seems to me that these are the questions that a new women's movement must work to address, and rethinking our reliance on abortion would be a good place to start. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. It is an honor to be here with you and to discuss for us women how life would be without Roe. I'm very excited about this. I feel like Erica's excellent remarks have set the stage. She's given you the legal arguments. I'm going to show you how those legal arguments translate to policy and to our relationships as women. So a couple things I want to make pretty clear. Casey is really the law of the land. Even if Roe is overturned, Casey's standards are still going to be what courts rely upon. Let me make a couple other things clear. First, overturning Roe will not result in the immediate prohibition of abortion. It will not. But reversing Roe does send abortion back to the states, which is a great thing because as you'll hear from Liz, there's a lot going on in the states. Secondly, life without Roe will not result in women being prosecuted. No woman will ever be prosecuted for having an abortion. Ever. In fact, pre-Roe, for decades, states protected women as the second victim of abortion. Women are still the victim of abortion. So what states will do is help protect those women and children. No woman will ever be prosecuted criminally for having an abortion. And this leads me to the key of all my remarks here. When the Supreme Court of the United States is no longer blessing and sanctioning abortion as a constitutional right, laws will change. People's hearts will change, our culture will change. We're going to see a lot of differences when the Supreme Court is no longer blessing abortion through Roe. So, what are going to be the benefits of life without Roe? Let me count the ways, and I've got three. Three big ways. First of all, and I know you're probably going to chuckle at this, but let me make my point. I got 10 minutes to do it. I think, number one, there's going to be improved romance in America. And I'm going to show you how. Number two, I think there's going to be improved marital strength in America. And number three, I think there's going to be improved family strength. Romance, marriage, and family. That's what I'm going to focus on. So I'm going to give you the opening remarks, and I'm hoping that we'll get some rebuttal during our dialogue time, because I'm going to try to be a little bit provocative in sharing with you what I think life is going to be like without Roe. So first, let's talk about improved romance in America. Roe's effect on romance has been dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. Roe changed women's relationships with men. It changed privacy between intimate partners. It directly led to negative effects on sexuality, which have ultimately, I think, made women's lives more challenging, even more dangerous, with a rise in expected premarital sexual intimacy. Expected. Reversing Roe could renew some of the emotional benefits of romance, and it could cause men and women to reevaluate the emotional closeness involved in a sexual encounter. Now, you might think that this is wishful thinking, but I I really do proffer that the availability of abortion has created this disconnect between sexual intercourse and procreation that has removed or caused to disappear a level of sexual caution in dating that is actually a benefit of emotional protection in dating. When Roe is no longer the law, I think romance can be restored, because right now, romance is lost in a culture of sexual expectation. It's just lost. But women's sexual choices do not need to be limited by Roe if Roe is no longer the law of the land. So I really do think also that reversing Roe could cause men to take greater responsibility. Erica made some remarks about how it's affected men and women's lives. Feminist scholar Catherine McKinnon, everybody in this room should know who she is. She wrote a great critique of Roe's extension of the privacy right, but she posits that abortion does not afford women more authority over sexual activity or reproductive choice, but rather, quote, that abortion facilitates women's heterosexual availability. Can I say that again? Catherine McKinnon said that abortion facilitates women's heterosexual availability. When Roe is no longer the law, abortion will no longer alter a woman's bargaining power in romance and sexuality. Things will be different. The availability of abortion has led to a casual sexual culture. It makes possible casual sexual attitudes that are really characterized by what we see now as the hookup culture. This casual sexual culture would begin its demise if Roe is overturned. In her book, Sex and the Soul, Dr. Donna Freitas, who's a sociologist, writes that the problem with the hookup culture is that it has promoted reckless, unthinking attitudes and expectations about sex. That she reports that college women and men that she interviewed were weary and fatigued by their sexual experiences. Let me read you a quote from her book. After a few years of living in this environment, they felt exhausted, spent, emptied by the pressure to participate in encounters that left them unfulfilled. Freitas was really surprised by her findings. Listen to what she writes next. At first, I was taken aback by students' stories about the party scene and the degrading experiences that many of them, especially the women, endured regularly. We are ostensibly living in the era of feminism and post-sexual revolution. Why weren't my students, weren't they supposed to be the beneficiaries of these movements? Why weren't they empowered and in control of their sexuality? I was even more surprised to learn exactly how powerless they felt in this culture that made them so unhappy. Her empirical research has shown this. Think about it. Our own AUL's Clark Forsythe, in his book, Abuse of Discretion, he's written, the availability of abortion has not reduced spousal abuse. It has not reduced poverty for women. It has not provided better job opportunities, but rather the paradigm of liberty and control has essentially magnified the power of uncommitted men, leveraging male influence over women and damaging male-female relationships. I proffer that reversing Roe begins to bring an end to that. Reversing Roe could mean re-empowerment for women. It could mean renewed romance. It might even mean more men taking responsibility. And that leads me to the second point, improved marital strength. So simultaneously weakening the moral fiber for marriage and the marriage bargain, Roe has robbed women of the marriage preference. In gaining the option of abortion, many women have lost the option of marriage. But reversing Roe could work to restore the marital preference. So Casey had a spousal notification requirement in it that was not upheld and was actually seen as a negative for women. It put too much of a burden on women to have to tell their husbands. Well, that prohibition has worked negatively towards more or less marital communication, I guess I'd say, and possibly has led to some marital breakdown. The autonomy set out in Roe as spousal is really spousal distancing in Casey. As a family law lawyer, every family law lawyer knows that a lot of marital breakdown happens because of the lack of communication. It's often cited as the primary source of marital breakdown. So what role Roe has had in the proliferation of divorce is a very complex matter. But what is clear and what can be clearly established is that Roe has really advanced individualism in marriage. The embargo of spousal notice in abortion negatively affects marital oneness and communication. The autonomy fostered by the abortion right is really unilateral. It's a unilateral choice of one marriage partner only. And it has created a wedge in that notion of marital oneness between a husband and wife that happens in marriage. Combine that unilateral choice of abortion with the unilateral choice of no-fault divorce. Only one party needs to decide, and what do you have? Only two individuals in marriage. It has severely weakened the moral fiber of marriage, and I think it has worked to help turn marriage into an institution that reflects more the individuals rather than the new family of a husband and wife. Marriage has become about prizing independence, about self-fulfillment. I think reversing Roe could change all that. Marital oneness can be restored. I think it can even be strengthened when a nation's highest court declines to uphold any longer the wedge into marital oneness that abortion creates. And that leads me to my third point. So we talked about romance, we talked about marriage, and what does every woman want? Adoring kids, a strong family. I know that's what all of us have talked about. Roe's effects on the family generally have been way more cataclysmic than we might have realized or previously understood. Roe's reversal could change that. Just as Roe created a wedge between a husband and wife, Roe created an even bigger wedge between parents and children. First, it endorsed the placing of a child's life in jeopardy from the very people that child most depends upon. That is a huge wedge between parents and children. Then, what Roe did was it helped to expand the mature minor doctrine, so parents who may have a teen child who is pregnant have little to no means to protect that child and to help that child do what's best for them. Even in states with parental notification or consent laws, a judge can still bypass those in every single state. So you think your state might have strong laws protecting parents. Any judge can bypass those if the child can convince the judge she's a mature minor. Reversing Roe would remove that wedge in the parent-child relationship. Harvard's Professor Marianne Glendon has expanded on this, and she argues that based on her work comparing abortion and divorce, she says that we really have an individual rights approach to the family rather than a unitary approach to the family. George Mason's Helen Alvare has written that we have an egocentric, adult-centered view of the family. She said most people view family and marriage more as a self-seeking than a self-giving institution. Well, it's because we have these wedges between parents and children, between husbands and wives. I think a life without Roe changes that. The effects on the family as an institution would be very positive, and reversing Roe could lead to a more unitary sense of what the family really is. Life without Roe would change that message to family members united in their protection of one another. And reversing Roe would certainly lead to decreased government involvement in the family. As a family law attorney, that's what I'm always concerned about, too much government in the family. Right now, abortion funding is something the government provides. That would no longer be routine. We'd love to stop that before Roe gets overturned, but it would be no longer routine if there's no Roe. Abortion, contraception, sterilization, no longer be required of employers. As a family law professor, best of all, I think the most wonderful thing that we would benefit from in a life without Roe is we would restore the value of a child to a family. Kids are so cheap, they show up in garbage bags. It's just so sad. It might mean even increased fertility rates. We, like all Western nations, are struggling with a total fertility rate that's too low to replace our population. Life without Roe could restore fertility rates. It might mean the restoration of family strength built on the common good of a family united together. So in conclusion, Roe's reversal would, I think, reverse ideology connected to cheapened sexual connections and poor romance. It would reverse ideology that devalues marriage, that devalues women, and that diminishes family importance. So a life without Roe could mean the beginning of a new age for romance, a new age for marriage, and a new age for families. Thank you.
That was very optimistic. I'm about to change the tone. No, I'm going to talk a little bit about the current environment that we're in right now, kind of in litigating the law, litigating in the space, what I think the future environment looks like, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what the kind of the legal costs of fighting this fight are. Right now, just in Louisiana alone, and I work closely and coordinate closely with a lot of states that have very strong pro-life laws and leadership in those states. So I'm frequently involved with and write amicus briefs collectively with states, including Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Missouri. I'm sure I'm leaving some out. Alabama, Texas, Indiana, Ohio are all kind of big, very active states. I write amicus briefs for them, they write amicus briefs for us, and we talk year-round all of the time about what's happening in our states and where things are in early litigation, in the circuit courts, and then all the way up to the Supreme Court. In Louisiana alone right now, I'm lead counsel in 5 active cases. One of them has a cert petition pending at the Supreme Court on the Medicaid choice of provider law and whether it creates a private right of action. That case is a Planned Parenthood defunding case. Texas has a similar case that was argued in the Fifth Circuit last week, and Kansas has a similar cert petition also pending right now on the same issue. Enormous consequences for states, enormous fiscal consequences that go well beyond anything having to do with Planned Parenthood. About a month ago, I argued our admitting privileges case, and if you remember, Whole Women's Health was an admitting privileges statute out of Texas that had significant impact on clinics in Texas, and that, we believe, was the real reason that the outcome was what it was in Whole Women's Health. But in the current environment, we are litigating in every single one of these cases what Whole Women's Health means. We're not talking about Casey, we're not talking about Roe, we're talking about Whole Women's Health and what that means, and did it change the law? Did it change Casey? Did it put us back into an environment of strict scrutiny? And are we now in this environment of pure balancing? And if it's 50.1%, we lose. And so our argument obviously is, no, it didn't change the law. Casey's still the law. Justice Breyer, and he cited to Casey. He started with Casey in Whole Women's Health. And so we think that it is not that hard of a leap for federal judges to recognize, and the circuit to recognize, that Whole Women's Health did not actually change the standard and move us backwards. But you would be probably shocked to see how hard it is sometimes to convince federal judges of that. We fight the fight at the district court level initially, and most of us expect to lose at that level. And if you look at all of the opinions, they generally are very well written. They are very long. They are heavy on credibility findings about the doctors who we hire as experts, who are all exceptionally smart and very good doctors, and we get to use them one time, because the next time their credibility has been attacked, and it's much harder to use them the next time. We aren't just litigating about Roe either. I mean, we're not just talking about a right of substantive due process and that kind of whole discussion. The arguments that are made in these cases revolve around equal protection, unconstitutional conditions. I have one right now where there's a Fourth Amendment claim for an unconstitutional search and seizure based on not giving clinics notification before we can come in and search their records. The judge actually upheld that on the motion to dismiss. There's only one other district court judge, federal district court judge in the entire country, who has upheld an attack on a Fourth Amendment grounds, and now there's 2, and one's in the Middle District of Louisiana. They are bringing equal protection claims where they compare, for example, in the burial of the fetal remains laws, a number of states have passed laws that require burial or cremation of human remains. The argument that they make is that women who have miscarriages don't have to do that, and that's an equal protection claim. And I'm saying, big difference between a miscarriage and an abortion. Judges don't they upheld the claim. So now that puts us into full-scale litigation where we're in discovery, and that is very detailed, expensive, and that is part of the litigation process, the game that the clinics and Planned Parenthood is very good at, in that they bring these claims and they put states into a situation where we have to litigate against at least I have at least a dozen lawyers that are enrolled in every single one of these cases, and they are all from different law firms. Not on my side, they're litigating against me, and most of them are big Washington, D.C. firms that have pro bono counsel. They will enroll at least a dozen lawyers in these cases because they get 1988 attorney fee claims under Section 1983. So these are federal claims where they have a lot of financial incentive if they win. Just one example of that in our admitting privileges case is the bill that they have submitted in that one case, and that case did not have live testimony. Everything was submitted on depositions and declarations. I think it was a three-day trial. So it was really probably as efficient as you can get. It was a single statute that was challenged, and they sent us a $4.7 million bill. If I get that decision reversed, they will get zero. If I don't get that decision reversed, and remember, I'm already fighting uphill because Whole Women's Health declared an admitting privileges statute unconstitutional, we will be then litigating how much money we have to pay Planned Parenthood. That was Hope Medical. That was it's not Planned Parenthood. But yeah, and we will probably end up paying at least half that to those law firms. And so there's a huge financial incentive for them in litigating these cases. So let's talk a little bit about what happens if Roe gets reversed and states can actually legislate in this area. We're still going to face some of these kinds of claims. The equal protection claims aren't going to go away. The unconstitutional condition claims aren't going to go away. And what we're going to see, I think, I think you are going to see a lot more state litigation at the state level. We already see that now in Arkansas and in Oklahoma in particular. They have Supreme Courts that have been more favorable, I think, to the pro-choice sort of claims on some of these things at the state level. And so what they're doing is they're finding the same right exists under state constitutions. And our Constitution, for example, has an express right to privacy. So all this discussion that you see about there's not an express right to privacy, that, the Supreme Court made all that up. Well, in a lot of state constitutions, there is an express right to privacy. And so you shift that litigation now to the state courts. And I think, what you are going to see is a lot more litigation in state courts, which is, from a financial standpoint, better because you may not get the attorney fee claim, although I have seen the attorney fee claim made in state courts based on the federal statute that permits attorney's fees. So we're litigating that too. But I think what you are also going to see is, and this is the good news. The good news is that I think you're going to see a shift back to the democratic process. You're going to see a shift to where it needs to be, and that's on elections. And elections do matter. We've seen that in a big way, I think, in the last couple of years. Certainly, the Trump administration has moved us in the right direction. HHS is making some very good changes with guidance that had been put in place. And if you don't live in the world of reading administrative regulations, then you may not realize how insidious that process can be. But I've seen it. I've seen it in the education regs. I've seen it in the HHS regs. I see it in the environmental regs. And there are a lot of lawyers out there who are really, really good at writing regs, and that makes them really, really good at changing a lot of law through regs. And so you have to be paying very close attention, I think, to be able to stay on top of all of that. And states are very active at that level too. So. And that can change with a presidential administration very quickly. So we're seeing some changes now that are very good, but they won't be permanent unless Congress acts. They won't be permanent without state legislatures and state constitutional changes, and with the right people being elected. So, I mean, I will leave you and I want to open it up to questions. I don't want to dominate your time talking about litigation, because I think at the end of the day, the takeaway is that litigation doesn't change the hearts and minds of people, and I think education does. And I think experience does. I think that the concept, I agree with everything that everybody has said here, especially that that the idea of abortion on demand has devalued our worth and our sexual relationships, interactions with men, and we see that with our daughters. We see that with our friends' daughters. I have sons, but I try to teach them, and it's just, I think it's hard. It's hard because individual rights and autonomy are two very, very powerful ideas in our culture. And until we can sort of present this and manage this discussion in a way that it teaches them that this enhances their ability to make decisions and have a more fulsome life and more fulsome relationships, I think it's hard to fight kind of a narrative that everyone's trying to restrict our autonomy and our individual rights and take that away. So litigation won't change people. It won't change their hearts. It won't change their minds. I think education will. But I do think that that the democratic process is going to be very, very much more engaged in a post-Roe environment. Roe carries a lot of meaning. It's, even though Casey is really what the law is, and and maybe whole woman's health, we'll see. But I think that just the word and just the discussion about the case really carries a lot of very, very powerful meaning for people. And if Roe gets overturned, that will carry just a lot of weight. And it will have a lot of meaning to people, and it will certainly trigger a lot of activity at the legislative level. Some of us, Louisiana has a trigger law. It's a law that says that if Roe versus Wade is overturned, then abortion is banned in Louisiana. Not every state has that. And so that's, I think you may see more of that as people move more toward actual, I think, embracing the idea that we're close to that happening. But it is going to matter who's on your state Supreme Court. It's going to matter who's in your legislatures. If you haven't been paying attention to who's on the state Supreme Courts in the states, then you're probably already behind the game, because in our state, at least, and in most states, those are 10-year terms. And so it's, we tend to, they don't, the politics of a state Supreme Court justice appointment or election, and they're all different too, by the way. In our state, they're elected. In some states, they're appointed. In a lot of states, they have retention elections instead of just an open election, or merit selection. So you see that too. You're going to see across the board, it's going to be very different how those justices get appointed to state Supreme Courts. And I would urge you to be engaged in that now, because it's going to make a huge difference when this happens. Not if, but when.
Thank you to our panelists, Erica, Lynn, Liz. Really just a productive and inspiring, a real discussion. And we really appreciate that. It sounds like it will be a tough road, but that there is great promise ahead. And that when Roe is overturned, Casey will still be the law of the land, but we can think of overturning Roe as almost that break in the dam, and that first step towards a lot more litigation in our future. We have time for a couple of audience questions, if we can.
Thank you. My question is for Liz, also from Louisiana. So I really want to thank you for the work that you're doing. And Liz, I know in the legislation that Louisiana has done, I have actually been a witness in some of that legislation, including the trigger law. Back in 2006, it was under Senator Nevers, who's now working in the governor's office. I want to ask you the power of women's testimonies that have had abortions, like myself and the women of Operation Outcry. been asked to testify many times in the legislation, and I know, like as you were talking about the changing of the heart, over those years, we have seen the changing of the hearts of the legislators, even to the point that some of them are sharing their own stories. So could you speak to that, to activate more women to go ahead and begin sharing their stories in the state, and not only that, but for their stories to be heard?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing that up, because it is hugely important. And I have been working in one of the cases that I'm litigating now, as I think you know, but it was originally a 7 statute challenge. Now it's 6. I think the judge dismissed one claim, but it's a 7. One of the laws is a 72-hour waiting waiting period. It extends it from 24 to 72. Another one of the laws is a dismemberment ban, and so part of what we're trying to build in those cases, and what I think's been absent, frankly, in some of the other cases that have been litigated already on some of these same laws in states around me, has been the voices of women who have had abortions, who are continuing to experience the trauma and the regret and the just relive that over and over again. And I think that is a voice that has been very absent from these cases. They tend to be very sterile. They involve a lot of experts. And the judges need to hear from women. I think, along with changing hearts, I think that hearing from women changes people's hearts and minds more than anything else. But I think it also changes judges' minds, and it certainly matters now more than ever in a in a whole woman's health environment. I don't know how many of you listen to oral argument tapes, but I do. And Justice Breyer kind of had my good friend Scott Keller holding him on the ropes, saying, do you have evidence of a single woman who's been helped by an admitting privileges law? And fortunately, in our case, we do have that evidence. We actually had a doctor, and one of the abortion doctors from one of the clinics, who had admitting privileges at the Shreveport Hospital, and he testified that he had inadvertently punctured a woman's uterus. He was an OBGYN, and he was able, because he had admitting privileges, he was able to take her directly to the hospital, admit her, repair the puncture, and teach residents how to do that repair at the same time. And so we had evidence in the record. But if you will look at the testimony of Whole Woman's Health, he said you have not a single piece of evidence of a single woman who was helped by this. And so Whole Woman's Health has changed the environment, both at the legislature and in the courts, especially in the courts, with our need to have actual testimony. We didn't think we needed that before, by the way. I mean, when we were litigating to defend state laws, we were operating under a Casey model that said, basically, if the state has a rational basis for the law, good, and it can be almost anything. It was like economic legislation. Once we come up with a good reason, we're done. It's not like that anymore. We have to present evidence that the law is rational, that there's not just, there are theoretically good reasons. We can't just put some law review articles or put some publications in the record at the legislative level or in the court record. I need testimony. And I think that the more women who are brave enough and will come forward and talk about their experience, the more important this narrative, the more powerful it becomes, because it just seems ridiculous to me to not acknowledge that this is such a momentous decision. Even if it's one that you feel compelled that you have to make, it doesn't mean that you aren't going to relive it for the rest of your life. And I think that message is what I hear from women. I do have 2 women who are going to testify in my case. I'm incredibly moved by their stories. I know without a doubt that this has defined their lives. And just as the alternate decision of giving a baby up for adoption can be a defining event in the opposite direction, in the better direction, I think that having an abortion certainly defines your life, and you will never, ever, ever forget it. And if you talk to all these women, you know it. I have had a hard time. I mean, some of the Operation Outcry, some of the declarations that were given by a lot of women through that process. A lot of them are dated, and I think that it is a great thing if we can get more women to kind of provide those types of declarations, agree that they will talk to us, and then that allows me to reach out to you and to the groups that are active in this space, and say, can you tell me the women who you're working with, and then I can reach out to them. And so far, the ones that I have reached out to are so happy to have a forum to be able to talk about their experience. It's cathartic for them. It's meaningful for them. It allows them to potentially influence a judge who's going to rule on whether someone has 24 hours before they have to, just 3-day waiting period. 3 days. We make women wait 3 days to give up a baby for adoption, and in Louisiana, we make them wait 5 if they have a lawyer. So we are careful about influence when it comes to giving up a baby for adoption. But we are, in this environment in the courts where we think that it is an undue burden to protect the decision-making space for a brief period of even 24 hours, because they're challenging those laws too. So thank you for that question. It's hugely important.
Thank you. And we are just about out of time, but would either of you like to just briefly respond to that idea of women's stories and the importance of women's stories?
I was just going to say that a woman's story that is not being told is women that have to abort their child because she's a little girl. The annihilation of women by women, and it's just so destructive to gender equity. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And when Erica said, if abortion is necessary for a women's equality, we really do have a misogynist jurisprudence. And that shouldn't stand. That shouldn't stand. We need to protect each other, and certainly our own little girls. So that's a story I'd like to hear.
So not to be, bring a little bit of a negative kind of comment here.
That's okay,
but,
I'm the pessimist.
Yeah,
or optimist.
No, I just think with regard to anecdotal evidence, obviously it's helpful and it can be moving to a judge, but there's anecdotal evidence on both sides. There tends to be anecdotal evidence on both sides. That's why you have this, amicus brief of I'm an attorney because I had an abortion. Again, anecdotal evidence, it could convince someone who's already sort of moved in that way, just as, someone who has abortion, trauma after having an abortion could convince someone that way too. So I just think, though I think these are good and important voices to be heard, absolutely, there's no question. I just think broad-based studies that aren't discredited are really important. And there are so many good broad-based studies, and that I think some of the meta-analyses that have been done are important as well. Obviously, having a woman there to, sort of put a face on some of that analysis is good, but I think money really needs to be put toward those kind of meta-analysis.
Thank you to our panelists. And we would now invite our health panelists to join us on the stage. This is Dr. Bush. So, Monique, you're right here. And then Frida, you're on the back. Okay. Thank you all for joining us. We are now commencing our health implications of overturning Roe panel. I'd like to introduce you to 3 medical practitioners who are deeply versed in women's health issues. First up is Dr. Monique Chereau, who is on the AUL Board of Directors and is an assistant professor at Duke University School of Medicine. She will share research on maternal mortality. Following, we have Dr. Christina Francis, Chair of the Board of the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, discussing preterm birth and mental health risks. And finally, Dr. Frida Bush, President and CEO of the Medical Institute of Health with over 50 years' experience in women's health. She will be discussing teenage risk factors. Thank you all.
Okay, can you turn on my PowerPoint? Thank you so much. Hello? Can you turn on my PowerPoint? Perfect. Okay, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you again for your gracious introduction, and just want to thank AUL and Heritage for the invitation. I'd like to speak, and I need to time myself because I talk too fast and tend to go over here. I'd like to speak very briefly about, here we go, health implications of reducing abortion rates. Next slide, please. Just disclaimers, I receive no funding from any commercial sources. It's the dream of my life to be able to say that I actually do receive lots of drug money, but I just haven't. And I receive no funding for this presentation. The views expressed in this presentation are mine alone, do not represent the views of any of my employers. Next slide. So this is the New York Times front page article when Roe v. Wade was decided, January 23rd, 1973. President Johnson had just died, and the High Court ruled that abortion was legal in the first 3 months. So obviously, as has been discussed, I think, in some detail, and I think very eloquently, this has been a tremendous cultural shift on a number of levels. Next slide, please. And this really represents at the heart of the conflict. Stop abortion now, keep abortion legal. And women and men we're in this process of trying to understand. But moving away from the political aspect of it, next slide. We can begin to look at the actual backdrop to Roe v. Wade, because Roe v. Wade, despite the perception, did not happen. It was not something that fell out of the sky. There was a very well-planned and well-thought-out strategy to legalize abortion in the United States. So Lawrence Lader, who's a champion for abortion and contraception, made this statement. He said that because contraception had not been scientifically perfected to meet every requirement of aesthetic preference and cost until the final solution, those are chilling words, by the way, was discovered, abortion was the essential backup. You had to have abortion. If you wanted to, women wanted to be free, women wanted to be able to contracept, abortion had to be the backup to ensure every child's being a wanted child. Next slide, please. And this was sort of reinforced in the 1960s by Garrett Hardin, who's professor of biology at UC Santa Barbara. And he pointed out that even contraceptives that have a 1% failure rate would produce 250,000 unwanted children a year. That was based on the US population at the time. And again, abortion was seen to be the much needed backstop in the system of birth control. Next slide. So I'm not really specifically speaking about contraception, but the point I'm trying to make is that as there was a consensus on multiple levels towards legalization of abortion, there was a vision of what abortion was going to be doing. And in the aftermath of that, we find that there have been many unintended consequences. Now, at present, approximately 0.7 to 1 million abortions are performed annually. But the question now, many years later, several decades later, is abortion good for women, and has it been a net benefit? Next slide, please. This is some data. I'm always going to get my geeky nerd thing on here. It's abortion surveillance 2012. Keep going. Next slide. And this is showing a fact which I think we're all aware of. Abortion rates have begun to decline after plateauing, having increased dramatically in the first decade or so after Roe v. Wade, and now beginning to decline. I don't have the slide here now, but the declines are especially noteworthy among teens. Next slide. But one of the questions that we have to ask is, what are the data about complications of abortion? We hear very frequently that abortion is safer than childbirth, and I'm not totally prepared to take on that question in 10 minutes. But I think that we can begin to look at some very simple, basic data issues. Because as politicized as one might be on the issue of abortion, if we look at the data, we look at complications of abortion, maternal mortality, effects of maternal mortality, and we can come to some conclusions. At that point, you don't have a problem with me or how I did my hair or what I'm doing. The problem is a data problem. So let's look at some data. So this is a study that was published in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. I'm a gynecologist, and so this is one of our two top journals, this and the American Journal of OBGYN. And it was looking at emergency department visits and complications after abortion. Next slide. And so, I'm sorry, go back to that previous slide. Thank you. And what these researchers did was to look at Medi-Cal, the California Medicaid database, and analyze abortion complications as best they could. Now, again, in 10 minutes, I can't really get into this in extreme detail. There are flaws with this database, but it at least begins to give us some idea, some kind of a platform, some kind of a floor under what abortion morbidity, what abortion complications look like in a diverse population, in a state where we don't really know how many abortions are done because California doesn't report to CDC. But this gives us a general idea. Next slide. So one of the conclusions that's very interesting here is that they looked at complications from medication abortion and first trimester aspiration abortion. And they found that major complications were 0.31 out of 100. Minor complications were about 5 out of 100. And then you can see the first trimester aspiration complication rates. Next slide. Now, when we're thinking about abortion complications, and we've heard about many of these, and again, as time has gone along, the literature on abortion complications has developed somewhat. But we know, for example, if you are counseling a patient who's about to have an abortion, we discuss the risks of bleeding, infection, damage to the uterus, in other words, uterine perforation, damage to pelvic organs. In this particular study, 0.87% of women had emergency department visits, 0.03% had ambulance transfer rates, and they talked about the major complications rates. These seem like low rates, right? I mean, all right, next slide. But if you translate this into the fact that we have anywhere from 0.7 to 1 million abortions a year, this adds up to some serious morbidity. So, for example, in this particular study, and I suspect that in this study there's somewhat of an underestimate of complication rates just because, and again, that's not obfuscation on the part of the researchers, it's just the limitations of the data. You find that the major complication rate resulted in probably about 11,500 women per year if you extrapolate this to the United States population having complications. Similarly, you can see the rest of the numbers. And the complication rates, interestingly enough, are significantly higher for medication abortion. So those, again, extrapolating to the US population would be about 26,000 complications a year versus 13,000 per year for first trimester aspiration. These are a lot of complications. So it's hard to, again, and this particular article was not written trying to say that abortion is a dangerous procedure. I think the researchers are being intellectually honest. But it is pointing out that the risks of morbidity are significant. And so again, this is the question that we run up against. Is abortion a net benefit to women? Like it or not, abortion is an elective procedure. For elective procedures, your index of care needs to be higher than it would be for an emergency procedure, for example, like cesarean section. Next slide. And I think most people have probably seen this. I won't really spend a lot of time. This is Linda Bartlett's study, which back in 2004, which looked at abortion mortality, not abortion morbidity, not abortion complications, abortion mortality. And they found that the risk of death in the results section increased exponentially by 38% for each additional week of gestation. In other words, for every additional week of pregnancy, the risk of a woman dying, not having a complication, but a woman dying, increased by 38%. And so obviously that's telling us that late abortions, there's a disproportionate amount of mortality with late abortions. And late abortions are, of course, as we're aware, the ones that are most commonly associated with sociodemographic factors like abuse, sexual trafficking, and adolescent pregnancy. And so really what's happened is that the added mortality, women's fear and coercion and so on and so forth, leads them to be undergoing this procedure at a later gestational age when obviously it's a much higher risk. Next slide. What's the evidence that fewer abortions might not be associated with increased maternal mortality? Chile is the first example that comes to mind. Until recently, abortion was illegal in Chile. That was one of the last things that dictator Pinochet did. He said abortion is illegal, and it was illegal. And Chile has had the lowest maternal mortality in Latin America, and actually one of the lowest maternal mortality rates. Ireland, until very recently, abortion was illegal. Maternal mortality rates there have been among the lowest in the world. And so I'm not commenting on the legality or illegality issue. I'm just pointing out that the question of whether or not abortion is necessary to reduce maternal mortality, I think you can see fairly clearly that that's not necessarily true. Next slide. Now, I do want to talk about one more complication before I'm finished, and I'm slightly over time here. What's the evidence that lower rates of abortion might be associated with fewer health complications or the obverse? Better health status for women. So several studies suggest an association with abortion risk for preterm birth. And there have been some recent publications that try to sort of put this to bed. However, the Institute of Medicine study in 2006, which was praised by all of the major OBGYN and pediatric societies, noted that the numerous effects to prevent preterm birth have had little success. Next slide. But if you look at the third immutable risk factor associated with preterm birth, it's prior first trimester induced abortion. And this is the Institute of Medicine making this statement. Continue, please. And I also want to comment, as I'm running out of time here, abortion is a fertility regulation strategy. And what I mean by that is that as contraception became available, as abortion became available, women's fertility regulation strategies changed. So, for example, in previous generations, there might have been, one of the fertility regulation strategies that women might have used was to delay the onset of sexual debut, right? By delaying the onset of sexual debut, the onset of sexual activity, until you were older, you're more likely to be married, have a stable, be in a stable relationship, however. And so with the availability of abortion and contraception, women's fertility regulation strategies changed. The fact that they have changed has had unexpected consequences. In other words, this particular Heminki et al., they're a group in Finland who studied this question, and what they actually looked at was rates of induced abortion in women who were coming for in vitro fertilization. Because their hypothesis was that at different points in women's lives, their fertility replacement strategies are in opposition, okay? That there's a tension there. Young women are trying to prevent or cancel their fertility. And as they get older, they're trying to be fertile. The problem is that very often, because of contraception and abortion, they may postpone their fertility to the point where they are truly either infertile because of age or infertile because of a prior infection or other problem. And so in this particular study, it's really a very interesting study, the use of abortion as a fertility regulation strategy was a risk marker for the use of in vitro fertilization, in other words, for future infertility. The other piece that comes in here is that as women's fertility regulation strategies changed, what we didn't realize is there are questions of oocyte health. And this is a new area that is really just starting to be evaluated. So what's oocyte health? We think about the particular pregnancy that a woman is having. We don't think about those future pregnancies, those eggs that are still developing, being exposed to hormones, being exposed to environmental factors that may change that particular embryo. If that woman does ovulate, if that egg is fertilized, becomes an embryo. And so again, when abortion was legalized, people hadn't really thought through or weren't aware of. We're just beginning to get some traction in this particular area of understanding that this is a holistic view of health. Next slide. And so rather than resulting in higher morbidity and mortality, reducing abortion rates is likely to lead to improved health outcomes for women. One of the other ways that this can happen is to change the focus to a focus on healthy timing and spacing of pregnancy, and to look at fertility as a marker for health. We so often look at women's fertility as a problem. It's a problem to be solved. And we say things like, well, you know, my contraceptive method failed and I got pregnant. No, failed technology, as Helen Alvarez says, does not lead to human life, okay? That's not true, okay? That's a fallacy. That's a logical fallacy. It's two people having sex, a sperm and an egg, that leads to a new human life being created. The failed technology is simply the manifestation of our obsession, as it were, with women's fertility. And I think one of the legal scholars made the comment, you know, we are dealing with a view of femininity, of female sexuality, in every area, in education, that was built for men. And guys, I'm not saying anything bad about you. I love, you know, I love my husband. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's what we're trying to at least think about, and I think some of my colleagues are thinking about, is a new and better paradigm. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Good, almost afternoon. I'm blessed and privileged to be up here with my fellow APLOG members, so it's a privilege to be up here with Monique and Frida, who have so much to add to this. I just wanted to speak a little bit to, as healthcare professionals, and especially healthcare professionals for women, really what our goal and our focus should be, and how abortion has really changed that for many people in our profession and for the patients that we care about. And to just illustrate this, I used to live in Kenya and work there at a mission hospital. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to get to know a pro-life Kenyan OBGYN who worked on the Ministry of Health there. And she was telling me one day about how an American NGO had come into the country and was really trying to push the abortion agenda, which is illegal. She went into a health clinic one day and she saw a poster on the wall there that had the Ministry of Health stamp of approval on it. Well, of course, her being a part of the Ministry of Health, she knew that they had given no such approval. And the poster said, "Safe abortions save lives." And she said she was so just offended by that, and you know, she ripped it down immediately off the wall, and thankfully that, oh, I'm sorry. Is that better? Okay. Thankfully, that NGO ended up being kicked out of Kenya for good, so that was very good. But I think that just epitomizes the lie that's being told to women across the world and to healthcare professionals as well. These lies are unfortunately being perpetuated very well by organizations like Planned Parenthood and other pro-choice organizations that make women feel that abortion is their only choice if they want to have control over their lives. But as we all know, abortion is not a part of comprehensive women's health care. In fact, it's the antithesis of that. It's very unhealthy for women, as we're here to talk about today. I also think, as we've been talking about and alluding to, that this is a very paternalistic view of women and their health. It reduces women simply to their reproductive organs, and that's it. And I don't know about you, other women that are in the audience, but I am much more than my reproductive organs. I consist of a lot more than that, not only as a human being, but also my health. There are a lot of other health issues that I have to deal with. The only health issue that I have to deal with is not simply my reproduction, even though it is a very important part of who we are as women. And I think that this paternalism is really reflected in the lack of truly informed consent that women are receiving when they show up for an abortion. As those of us who are healthcare providers know, especially just not only from a taking care of your patient standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint, we are bound to give fully informed consent to our patients. When we all have the blessing of being able to deliver babies, and it's one of the most exciting things that we get to do. But even when, what? When it goes right, that's right. When it goes wrong, it's a little bit hairy and sheds years off of our lives, I think. But even when I think a woman needs a C-section for her benefit or for her child's benefit, and it's very clear that this is what needs to be done so that she and her child can have healthy outcomes, I still have to go through my list of these are the potential complications of your C-section. I recommend it despite these complications, as Monique alluded to, for more emergent procedures, that benefit takes significant risk or significant preference over the risks. But I still have to go through those things with her because that's informed consent. She's going to have a procedure that I'm performing on her. The onus is on me to let her know these are all the potential risks. Now, I think the benefit of this procedure outweighs those risks, but you have to know going into it that these are potential outcomes. This is standard practice for anyone in medicine across all disciplines, and we do this for every procedure, and it's considered expected. If you have to go to court over a complication that you had and you were found that you didn't give informed consent to your patients, you might as well, your license is going to be taken away because it's so expected. The only people that get a blank check as far as this goes are abortion providers, and that's not appropriate. It's not empowering for women. What it's saying to women is that I know better than you do what's best for you, and so just listen to me when I tell you that you need this abortion. And the health risks are significant. One of the problems that we have, and again, Monique alluded to this, is that we don't have a lot of good data to show us what the actual abortion complication rates are in a lot of places. States like California don't even have to report the abortions that they do, and their complications aren't tracked. I'm from Indiana, and recently we passed a law requiring abortion complications to be reported as such so that they can be tracked as a public health outcome measure so that we can look at that. Of course, it's now going to be tied up in the courts because Planned Parenthood is suing over this. And again, this has nothing to do with restricting women's right to an abortion. It's simply saying we need good data. We need to know what's happening to women. Maybe this tracking will actually affirm their case that abortion is safe. I don't think that it's going to, but if abortion really is safe, then why do they have an issue with us tracking their complications, right? Of course, I think they know that it's not going to prove that, so that's why they're fighting it. So I just wanted to touch on just 3 of the major health impacts that we look at that we have decent data to support for women. One of the first ones is mental health disorders. So we hear this talked about a lot, that a lot of women regret their abortions. And as you so boldly shared with us that, when you're willing to share their stories, and you hear this from many, many women, that abortion has a long-lasting impact on them, on their mental health. We know that suicide rates in women who have had abortions versus women who haven't are 6 times higher. And this holds true even in women who had unintended pregnancies and then carried their pregnancies to term versus women who then had an abortion. And I think this is a really important point to make because this is an argument that's used in support of abortion, right? If we force these women to carry their unwanted pregnancies, it's going to have a negative impact on their mental health. We actually know if they choose life for their child, whether they choose to parent or place their child for adoption, that their mental health outcomes are actually going to be better. We see a significantly increased risk of depression, of anxiety, of drug abuse, and actually domestic abuse as well in the homes of women who have had abortions. And so this is really significant. It's difficult to track sometimes because oftentimes this doesn't manifest for several years. Women will struggle with depression or anxiety and not even understand why until they get into counseling and then realize that it all stems back to their abortion. There was one large meta-analysis that was published that showed an 81% increased risk of mental health problems in women who have had abortions. But the really interesting number in that for me was when they looked at all women that they looked at who had mental health disorders, 10% of those mental health disorders were attributable to a woman's abortion alone. So no other risk factors for mental health other than the fact that she'd had an abortion. So while I'm not claiming that 100% of women are going to be depressed because they had an abortion or be anxious because they had an abortion, 80% is a significant number, an 80% increased risk. That's a significant number. And the problem with saying as the other side likes to say, that you should be proud of your abortion and you should shout it out loud and you should be proud, is that for all of these women who are struggling with depression, with anxiety, and all of that, they're made to feel shamed that they're feeling that because they're being told that's not normal. You shouldn't feel that. You should feel happy about your abortion. And so they really have no venue to speak about this. And they're just being shamed and made to feel like there's something wrong with them because they feel that way. We need to help women to understand that this is normal, that you're feeling this, and we want to be there to help you and assist you. The second big health risk that Monique alluded to as well is preterm birth and future pregnancies. And really and truly, when it comes to health risks from abortion, I personally find this one the most heartbreaking. And part of that is because right now I work as an OB hospitalist, so I work in the hospital taking care of high-risk pregnant patients. And I have a lot of pregnant patients who come in and deliver at 22, 23 weeks just before their baby can be viable and survive, and they lose their babies. And one sticks out very clearly in my mind who lost her 6th baby in a very similar way. And when you looked back into her history, she had lost 6 wanted children, but prior to that, she'd had either 2 or 3 abortions, I can't remember which. And I sat there knowing that that was probably the reason why she'd lost all these children. And just my heart was breaking for her because she made that decision for those abortions at a time when she wasn't ready to be a mom. She wasn't ready to start her family. And now she so desperately wanted children that she'd tried again, and again. And we'd tried pretty much every medical technology that was available to help her get to the point where she could have a healthy child, and it had failed yet again. And so this is a double assault on these women, right? They're going through the trauma of their abortion, and then they're losing children at a time in their lives when they really want to have them. And this is a really now well-proven association. In fact, the American College of OBGYNs has now been forced to acknowledge this after multiple studies have proven this association. So, and it's significant. The preterm births that are increased in women who've had abortions are not just mildly preterm births, they're very preterm births, so prior to 32 weeks at a time when those children are either not going to survive or have a significant risk of long-term health complications. And one of the largest studies that was done that actually looked at over 1 million women showed that just one surgical abortion increased a woman's risk of preterm birth by 60% in future pregnancies. And if they had 2 or more abortions, their risk was increased by 93%. So this is really significant. And this is something this is a stronger association than what's seen with cigarette smoking and preterm birth. How many of you have heard that cigarette smoking causes preterm birth, right? Probably everybody. It's on every pack of cigarettes. And it's not even a very strong association, and it's a changeable risk factor. Abortion is not a changeable risk factor. Once you've had it, it's done, and that risk is there. We continue to see our preterm birth rate climb in this country, and it's been baffling people. Why can't we decrease our preterm birth rate? And there's a lot of factors that play into it. I'm not saying that abortion is the only factor. But I truly believe that one of the reasons we haven't been able to impact it is because we're seeing the results now 1 to 2 decades later, potentially, of all of the abortions that have been happening. But also because we're not addressing this as a risk factor. Women aren't being told, what if they would change their minds if they know that they were at risk for delivering preterm in their future pregnancies? This is part of what informed consent needs to contain. We also see a racial disparity, a significant racial disparity in preterm birth rates. So the preterm birth rate in the African American population is about 2.5 times that in the Caucasian population. Their abortion rate is 3 times the abortion rate in the Caucasian population. And again, I'm not saying this is the only thing that explains that disparity, but I do think it has a significant part to play in that. And so this is almost like a double genocide, I would say, of the African American community. We know that Black babies are aborted at a much higher rate, and then we're also losing them later because they're being born preterm. The third thing that is somewhat controversial, but we do think that there is some association there, is an increased risk of breast cancer. And this is not all abortions that cause an increased risk of breast cancer, but it does appear to be increased in risk for those women who have abortions prior to having their first full-term pregnancy or first full-term birth. So there does appear to be an association there, especially for women who have multiple abortions prior to their first full-term pregnancy. And one study out of China, where there's a lot of forced abortions, showed that one abortion caused a 33% increased risk in breast cancer if it was, again, prior to their first full-term pregnancy. And in women who had had 3 or more abortions, they had 165% increased risk. So again, this is a really significant factor that we at least need to be taking a closer, honest look at for women. And again, we see a racial discrepancy in this as well. We're seeing more aggressive breast cancers in Black women that are occurring at younger ages. And, it takes about 10 to 20 years for a breast cancer to develop, and we started to see this increase about 10 to 20 years after Roe was instituted, and that number of abortions shot up. So again, this is not coincidental that we're seeing that. So how could women's health benefit from a reversal of Roe v. Wade? Well, I would say that physicians would feel free to go back to life-affirming care, which is what most physicians went into medicine for. We're here to promote health. We're here to promote the life of our patients. And for those of us who take care of pregnant women, we have 2 patients that we're caring for that entire pregnancy. I've always found it very interesting that as a physician, I'm responsible to intervene if that unborn child is in distress. I'm responsible to intervene and do something to help save that child's life. And yet, as an OB physician, I also can be responsible for ending that child's life without any sort of repercussion if that's what the mother wants, or if that's what she's being forced into. And so, as physicians, I think it would free us up to be able to practice life-affirming medicine that would promote health. We also would be empowering women. We wouldn't be telling them lies anymore. We'd be giving them the truth. We wouldn't be practicing paternalistic medicine where we tell them, this is what's good for you, just listen to me, your life will be better. We'd be giving them all of the information that they needed to have. And in no other area of medicine, even in what we practice as OBGYNs, do we recommend treatments or procedures to our patients that we know have significant health risks and really have zero health benefit. And I think that's an important point to make. There is no documented health benefit whatsoever for elective abortion for women. There's never been a documented health benefit for women of elective abortion. And so why are we recommending a procedure to our patients that, 1, we know kills one of our 2 patients, and 2, has significant negative health effects for women and zero health benefit, but yet we're recommending this to women as one of their options? So as a physician, I think it would really free me up and give me the option of practicing pro-life medicine, as well as giving women more power over their health decisions. Thank you.
And I'm going to talk about teenagers and abortion. And most of what we've talked about has been the grown folks. But I'm going to talk about it. And I'm going to start out with I have 3 sections of this presentation, and we'll give a little anecdote for each one. In the first anecdote, I had, these are patients of mine that I've taken care of in my practice. And I've been practicing for about 50 years before I retired recently. 22-year-old senior in college came into my office, and she was brought in by her mom because she had a positive home pregnancy test, and they brought her in to get a real pregnancy test. And she had had a previous pregnancy as a senior in high school, but she had aborted it at the encouragement of her parents because she was going to be the first child to graduate from high school. And they didn't want her to be embarrassed walking across the stage with a large belly. And so this time, she had a similar circumstance. She's a senior in college now, and she has a positive pregnancy test. And she doesn't want to walk across the stage with a large belly. And she had used condoms in the past, and they had always worked for her. And she when I asked the mom what was her thinking this time because of the past experience, her mom said to me, "She's grown now, so I'm letting her make her own decision." They left the office that day to go get an abortion. And I can tell you, they were more concerned about shame and embarrassment than they were about what was happening to the daughter. Her behavior had not changed. Condoms had failed, but her behavior had not changed either. And so I wondered that day, what if that mama had told her daughter, "I'm sorry I had made that decision for the first abortion"? Would that second grandchild have actually lived? So what we know now for sure about teen pregnancy and abortion in the United States is that in 2015, we have the latest statistics, a total of 229,715 babies were born to women between ages 15 and 19, with a birth rate of 22.3 per thousand women in this age group. This is a record low for teen births in the United States, and teens have dropped 8% in that 1 year between 2015 and 2014. And the rates they thought had dropped because young people were making better decisions about their sexual activity, which I think is a real plus. As a matter of fact, this is a report from the CDC, and it says declines are due to more teens abstaining from sexual activity and more teens sexually active using birth control than in previous years. So that's a plus. The numbers are going down because behavior has changed for the most part. In 2010, teen pregnancy and childbirth accounted for at least $9.4 billion. So it's costly when a teen has a pregnancy. $9.4 billion of tax dollars. Increased health care, increased incarceration rates among children of teen parents, and low tax revenue because of lower educational attainment and income among teens. So there are greater risk when a teen has a child for the child. Pregnancy and birth are significant contributors to high school dropout rates among the girls. Only about 50% of teen girls receive high school diplomas by 22 years of age, whereas 90% of women who do not give birth graduate. Children of teen mothers are more likely to have lower school achievement and to drop out of high school, have more health problems, be incarcerated at some time during adolescence. Excuse my cold. More likely to be incarcerated at some time during adolescence. They're more likely to give birth as a teen, to face unemployment as an adult. And all of these are related to the fact that they're not only sexually active, but becoming pregnant. Teen abortion is legal in all states. This is something we know for sure, though some require parental permission or notification, and others do not. At a time when schools are not allowed to give students aspirin without parental permission, they can take them for an abortion and the parents not even be notified. That law is actually very incongruent with common sense. I can imagine if a complication occurred that they not call the parents and the parents then be responsible for the financial care of that. In Minnesota, teenage abortion has declined since the passing of the parental notification laws in the 1980s. The impact of that law has been significant in that by 1992, 29 states had enacted similar parental consent laws and notification laws, and each of those states are now showing declines. So it works when parents are encouraged to be involved. On one level, this reveals that parents wanting to protect their children choose to allow the birth of their teenagers, infant, rather than choosing to abort. Advocates for the pro-choice movement choose to ignore the risk involved in having an abortion, and they deny the moral and religious implications arising from the biological reality of abortion. Teen pregnancy is a decision that will impact a teen's life dramatically, whether the decision is to abort or to give birth. Teens need to understand that people you know will choose to support your decisions or condemn your decisions, but this is your decision, and you will live with the choice for the rest of your life. Once an abortion has been done, it can't be undone. So it makes sense to take the time to think and know what you are going to do with your body and to the life inside your body. If you decide to bring a child into the world, there will be some criticism. There will be some inconvenience and times of sadness, but there will also be times of great joy. Shortly after conception, the miracle of DNA is underway, forming a unique human almost immediately. And so from the time that sperm hits that egg, you are creating another unique human being. At 8 weeks, you may not feel it, you may not know that you're pregnant, you may not have taken the pregnancy test, but the baby has a heartbeat and every organ is present. Now, are there risks associated with teen abortions? We've heard what we've said about the adults. The young people are no different. Studies have proven that abortion may lead to increased chances of breast cancer, pelvic inflammatory disease, depression, not to mention the death of the mother due to excessive bleeding or other complications. Whether the choice is to keep the baby or to put it up for adoption or to have an abortion, hormones run crazy in pregnancy, but you can get over it. Pregnancy is a temporary event. As the life inside grows, the teen mother will become attached or perhaps even angry at this new life. But this life is exactly that. He or she is alive and is a part of the teen's life. It is a part of reality. Antidote number 2, and by the way, these are patients that I've seen in my practice. A 33-year-old woman came in my office to consult on how to achieve pregnancy. She had had a previous abortion at age 19, prior to her marriage. Now married, she completed her education. She's now married. She has a good job. She's ready. Both she and her husband wanted a child. She had seen another OBGYN. She had also seen a fertility specialist because he suspected that she had infertility. And she had been told by both her physician and by the infertility specialist that she could not get pregnant. Her husband, however, was fertile. So she presents to me, because someone recommended that I could do it. After reviewing her paperwork, I concurred with the assessment and began to offer alternatives like adoption and even surrogacy, especially since her husband was fertile. As I'm explaining to her and trying to be optimistic, she drops her head. She was silent. Then she began to cry softly. And as she began to cry, the tears began to flow. And then her shoulders began to move. And then you could hear audible cry. When I tell you, I didn't have enough tissue in my office to console her, to wipe her eyes. When she realized that the only child she would ever conceive was the one she had aborted. Adoption, she wasn't ready to talk about at that time. So, what do we know? There are consequences to the decision that we made. And one of the things that we should have to do is give more information about what the reality is of what happens when you conceive. Teen teens facing an unplanned pregnancy, choosing an abortion, need to understand what are the consequences, and this information should be given to them prior to executing the procedure. Teens have the same concerns. Do I really want this baby? Can I afford this child? But also, what will happen to the child? But what will happen to me? Am I ready to be a mother? Then I may want to decide to abstain sexually or to use some type of more reliable birth control consistently. Teen abortion is a decision that will impact their lives dramatically. The lady that I just told you about was 19 when she made the decision, but here is now at age 33 that she's realizing the impact on her life. Teen abortion is a decision that will impact them dramatically. People you know will choose to support your decision or condemn your decision, but this is your decision. Now that's the point that I make to my patients. This is your decision. Mama and dad may be there to help you, but it is you that will carry the child. It is you that have the responsibility for it. And again, making the decision about sexual activity prior to is a very vital decision. Whether you use abstinence or delay of immediate gratification, if you would, with sexual activity, or whether you use some type of birth control, consider that is a factor. Teens, we know, may not understand that abortion kills an innocent life. The teens exist because her mother chooses to give birth to her. Will she do the same for her child? Third anecdote. 19-year-old student at a very prestigious college became pregnant and informed her parents. They didn't want the pregnancy to interrupt her education and the plans for her future, so they recommended an abortion. The abortion met with complications and she was taken to the hospital by ambulance. Surgery was required. She was placed in the ICU. Subsequently, sepsis set in and she did not regain consciousness. True story. Weeks later, she was transferred to a nursing home in her state where she eventually died. Needless to say, her parents regretted their decision. Needless to say, her death was never reported as an abortion-related event. Just as Monique mentioned, California doesn't report to the CDC. Other states do not either. So we never know that these events occur. They are not part of the statistics. 20% of those having abortions are teens. What are the health and well-being implications if 1/5 of our future generation is killed and their mothers and fathers are left physically and emotionally scarred? Legalized abortion does not eliminate serious complications. We have a very poor handle on legalized abortions or mortality statistics. Actually, the CDC says they do not have accurate abortion and abortion complication statistics because the states are not reporting them. We know for a fact the year that Roe was legalized, there were 39 maternal deaths from abortions reported, and those are just the ones we know about. I close now imagining life without Roe. One might say, even I dare to dream of an abortion-free nation. I know the lawyers have presented their views today, and we have presented other health statistics. For the mother, the child, the father, and society, I wonder, what changes can we make? And if we have the guts or the chutzpah, if you would, to do it. As I close, I thought about a famous speech that was delivered right here in Washington, D.C. over 50 years ago by Dr. Martin Luther King. He spoke of a dream for his children and how they were to live. He also had another speech, a letter that he wrote from the Birmingham jail, in which he stated, "Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." I think we have to consider that something has to be done. And I'm anticipating life after Roe. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Shiro, Dr. Francis, Dr. Bush. Unfortunately, we're a few minutes behind time, so we don't have time for audience Q&A right now. We do believe that the panelists will be available for some one-on-one discussion, both during the 5-minute break that we have right now and also over lunch for those who are able to stay. So please join me in thanking our panelists again. We'll take a brief 5-minute break and return here starting promptly at 11. Thank you. Very well. Yeah, it was very productive. A shame to miss the Q&A, but the conversation, what you all presented was so good, so meaty, so many good statistics.
I am not the only traveler who is not repaid his debt. I've been searching for a trail to follow again. Take me back to the night we met, and then I can't tell myself what the hell I'm supposed to do. And then I can't tell myself not to ride along with you. I had all and then most of you, some and now none of you. Take me back to the night we met. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, haunted by the ghost of you. Oh, take me back to the night we met, when the night was full of terror and your eyes were filled with tears, when you had not touched me yet. Oh, take me back to the night we met. I had all and then most of you, some and now none of you. Take me back to the night we met. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, haunted by the ghost of you. Take me back to the night we met. Rigorous consumption, dangerous dysfunction, disguised as expensive taste. Stumble, people disgraced by what I claim I need and what I wanna waste. I take no account for nothing if it's not mine. Misappropriation of funds, protect my 90% with my guns. Whose side am I on? Well, who's winning? My kingdom built with the blood of slaves, orphans, widows, and homeless graves. I sold their souls just to build my private mansion. Some people say that my time is coming. Kingdom come as the justice running down, down, down on me. I'm a poor child, I'm a lost son. I refuse to give my love to anyone. Fight for the truth or help the weaker ones, because I love my Babylon. I am a slave, I was never free. I betrayed you for blood money. Oh, I bought the world, all is vanity. Oh, my Lord, I'm your enemy. Come to me and find your light. Children sing Zion's inside. I said, don't trade your name for serial number. Priceless lives were born from under. Praise where I found you. Said my name ain't yours, yours is not mine. Mine is the Lord and yours is my child. That's how it's always been. Time to make a change, leave your home, give to the poor all that you own. Lose your life so that you could find it. First to be last when the true world come. Living like a humble fool to overcome this upside down wisdom of a dying world. Zion now built with hands, and in this place gotta dwell with man. Sick be healed and the crippled stand, singing hallelujah. My kingdom built with the blood of my son. Selfless sacrifice for everyone. Faith, hope, love, and harmony. I said, let this world know me by your love, by your love. Oh, my child, daughters and sons, I made you in love to overcome. Free as a bird, flowers in the sun. On your way to Mount Zion, all you slaves, be set free. Come on out, child, and come on home to me. We will dance, we will rejoice. If you can hear me, then follow my voice.
We just get 3 minutes of your time. Give or take a second or two. So when they ask you about the culture, tell them I know it well. Hey! Come on. This is what you get when you mix Tony Hawk with Ice Cube, NWA, and the Bones Brigade. Let me talk to him. Hey, hey, I'll catch me hopping knock Chamba, North corner of CNT or 20 minutes east to South Central, that's West Coast beat. Broken families and pasta, black rock and white pasta. Jimi Hendrix, Cortland, about I'm mocking all your preconceived. The narrative vibrate, the heritage makes a man stand with his spine straight. The ground that grew Kendrick, Anthony Kiedis, Incubus. Music that speaks to the Jim Morrison. Each of us share the same nutrients. Set mind got laced with divine DNA, gon' face it. The child of a freedom fighter, trial like graffiti writers, wild like the freedom riders. We are all day walkers, hybrids, bilingual, bicultural, flowing in a king's tongue. Elohimic human one, Rosetta Stone with a mic and some chucks on. All things to all men, say all men. Were you the product of a panther and mama's prayers answered? You don't even think twice. Be like, let's go, let's go, let's go. They ask you about the culture. Say what? Say I know it well. I know it well. I know it well. Yes, sir. I know it well. I know it well. Hey, holla at him, Craig. You got it, bro. Yeah.
Hey, look, my homies told me back when I was playing my Nintendo to stay away from windows, cause bullets, they tend to hit those. My mama told me when I got the PS1 to skip the BS and lead us a BS numb. As every other brother throwing up colors in my community. I knew better, but couldn't do better. But then I grew to be the same dude, reading Wayne Grudem, even though I grew up listening to Snoop and Ice Cube. Be amused at the music, we use that to bruise cats' egos. Nowadays you might find me under the steeple, preaching to the people, or making me a sequel to mixtapes, get shin scrapes and skate parks. I'm everything in one, I'm the product of great art. I'm the product of Descartes, Tim Keller, and Outkast. Iconoclast, the glass ceiling that they put above me. The reason that they hate me, the same reason they love me.
Were you the product of a
Of Roe versus Wade. Wow, that worked. Okay. That is providential. The end of the tyrannical era of Roe versus Wade, right? So my mic started working at that moment. Although I'm not really a legal scholar to say that, but it was delivered as legislation from the Supreme Court. So I was asked to speak to the question of what, if anything, the economics and social science literature can say about what we might expect if Roe versus Wade were to be reversed. And this is a very difficult task from the perspective of the literature, if I'm speaking as a scientist, per se. And so I actually want to unpack what that means exactly. Why is this a difficult task? And why, in fact, am I going to tell you that there's very little in the literature about this question? And I will, at the end of my remarks, try to get at the question in a sort of oblique way, and careful to make it clear that the task that social scientists could do has in fact not been done. The silence is actually sort of deafening on this question. If you want to look at what the leading economists have written, that could be helpful for us to think about what the undoing of Roe versus Wade might mean for the labor market, for instance. But there are some implications I think are ripe for the taking. So the reason, so I'm going to speak really to the science here. The reason that from the perspective of social science that this is a difficult question to answer is there's sort of two, and combined together they're very difficult. The first is that the standards over time for making what we would call causal claims in social science have become high. By high, I'm going to say almost too high. So a lot of my colleagues would say perhaps too high indeed for making causal claims about things which are controversial. The second is that we're interested in the effect of a counterfactual. Right? So what would happen if something were not around, that is around, right? So this is difficult from a perspective of the scientific literature. So to make now, these days, so speaking to the first point about the standards for making causal claims. To make it now, these days, today, this was not true 30 years ago, but today to make an appropriately scientific argument, and I'm speaking about the kinds of things that can be published in leading journals, not the sort of thing that I might make in a different context. To make an appropriately scientific argument about the effect of X on Y, for instance, the effect of Roe versus Wade on subsequent labor market outcomes for women, we want to have something, well, this is now what counts as scientific evidence, something like evidence based on an experimental design, right? And that would require, at a minimum, the random assignment of women to treatment and control groups, some women having access to legal abortion and some women not having access to legal abortion. But of course, this is absurd, and it's not something that in social science we can often do. Very few opportunities to work from a true scientific design. So sometimes we have what we call access to we call a natural experiment, where God or nature or often public policy, our friends across town, happen to randomly or quasi-randomly distribute people to different treatment and control groups. Where it used to be enough, again, I can't stress this enough, the standards have changed, but even as early as as recently as when I started college, it was still good enough to make kind of correlative arguments, right, based on correlation. This is no longer the case. Multivariate regression analysis, which looks very attractive, is still not actually today sufficient, because multivariate regression analysis is still merely correlative. So this is very difficult. To meet this gold standard, leading economists are constrained to make arguments based on some sort of experimental or natural experimental design. In the case of Roe versus Wade, there's only one natural experimental design that has been used by leading economists. And this is the quasi-random way in which some women had early access to abortion, so pre-Roe legal abortion states. This would include, say, California, legalized or dropped their penal restrictions on abortion in 1967. And other women had late access to abortion, right? So these are sort of treatment and control groups that are kind of quasi-random. Late access to abortion at the time when Roe versus Wade was applied to all of the states. So Roe sweeps through the remaining states that still don't have access and applies access to all the remaining states. So this is the design, using this quasi-experimental design or this natural experimental design. This is the design that was used in the now infamous paper by John Donahue and Stephen Levitt. And of course, in my mind, I thought this was about 3 years ago. And then I looked it up, and this is actually 17 years ago. The John Donahue and Stephen Levitt paper called The Impact of Legalized Abortion on Crime.
for the younger folks in the room, the younger folks in the room probably do not remember this. This paper aimed to show that legalized abortion had reduced violent homicides in this country about 18 years after legalization. So abortion, yes, you heard that correctly, reduced crime 18 years after legalization. So in other words, we produced fewer, essentially fewer black males into violent parts of the city, and so 18 years after abortion, we had less crime. I have lots of comments on that, but we'll save that for later if we have time. Yeah, so this was, it was a kind of a brief debate at the time, and it's an awful, just do one crime, and then 18 years later we have less of another kind of crime. So you might reasonably now ask, well, this is a great example. So here, look, there's this great natural experiment available to social scientists. We have these early and late legalizing states, and think about all of the other things. So Donahue and Levitt looked at, homicides in inner cities. We can think about all kinds of other things: domestic abuse, child abuse. We can look at the famous abortion and breast cancer link. All of those are studies that are ripe to be done. And so you might ask, for instance, where are the mountains of other papers in the intervening 17 years? Because I sort of didn't remember it was 17 years since the Donahue and Levitt paper was done. The answer to my knowledge is approximately 0. So I've been thinking about this for 15 years, but I don't have the resources to get those things done. And again, that's another commentary, but I wasn't asked to speak about the bias in social science or the reasons why, but I will comment briefly on that quite at the end. So I'm calling this something like deafening silence, right? So to do things according to the gold standard, you have to do it this way, and approximately 0 studies have been done, besides the one which purported to find a great social positive impact 18 years after the legalization of abortion. So the second reason is difficult to say what the literature can tell us about women's outcomes in a post-Roe America is that we are trying to answer the effect of not X on Y, sort of the effect of a counterfactual. This is something that the data can't reasonably offer up to us. In other words, even if we could get the right natural experiment, the ideal data, what we would call, we typically think that reversing a policy doesn't get us back to the pre-policy universe. And this is a very difficult thing. It's a fallacy to extrapolate from X leads to Y. So if we could do, here are the effects of X and Y, to something like not X gives rise to not Y. This is not something we can do in social science. All kinds of things have changed, and almost 50 years intervening is not a small period of time. So taken together, the first 2 points lead to the conclusion that we have in the case of imagining a post-Roe world. From the perspective of the science, a crushing absence of evidence, right? So an absence of evidence. And I'm going to say that this is both good news, but it's also a challenge for those of us who are interested in undertaking this creative exercise that we're tackling today, and well worth tackling. As we know, absence of evidence is not something we can take to mean evidence of absence. So the fact that we cannot say, based on the data, that Roe versus Wade has delivered on the various far-flung promises to bring women to new levels of labor market equality, happiness, or social mobility is by itself telling, right? So we don't have evidence of those things. If we know anything at all about, for instance, women's happiness, we know, based on Stevenson and Wolfer's paper, The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness, that women's self-reports of happiness, it's not that bad as science, are flattening out or have declined since the early 1970s. And this is not due to abortion, but provides the sort of absence of evidence that I'm referring to, right? So there's no existing evidence of all of these things kind of working out well. But the case is a little bit more complicated than what I want to say. So we simply do not have evidence that abortion is linked causally to large improvements, and not even to small ones, in women's life course outcomes. So that's about as much as I can say in 10 minutes, but we don't have evidence. Not that meets the gold standard. Right? And this is the good news. But it is also not evidence of absence, so we also cannot say based on the data that legal abortion did not lead to some or all of the various good things that have happened for the so-called elite or upper class women. So most of us sitting in this room, certainly myself included. On this point, it's very interesting, the waters are somewhat muddy. So things have in fact gotten better. at least in terms of social outcomes that we can measure conventionally, right? So those of you who are interested in, say, religious outcomes or the transcendental things, we don't measure these things conventionally in social science, but the things we can measure conventionally, things have gotten better for women in the upper socioeconomic groups. It might well be that abortion has played a role in this. Okay, so this was Akerlof, Yellen, and Katz's idea that perhaps abortion might have a differential effect on women who are willing to use it and not willing to use it. Note the Akerlof, Yellen, and Katz paper, which is now, if I do my math, I'm obviously out of date on all of these things, and I can't do math anymore. But this paper is over 20 years old, right? This was, I think, a 94 paper. That was not a data-driven argument, and that paper could not be published today in a leading economic journal. It could not be published today. I have had authors reject papers on the grounds that this sounds just like Akerlof. In fact, this builds on Akerlof, but today that is not something we can publish. This happens over and over. So Akerlof's paper with together Janet Yellen, our near neighbor, and Michael Katz suggest perhaps that abortion had a differential effect on the or could have a differential effect on the socioeconomic outcomes of both from upper class and lower class women, for lack of a better set of terms. The challenge then is for well-trained social scientists to investigate the role of abortion in these changes in women's outcomes, those that experienced improvements, right, on average, the upper class women, and those that are worse. But in this task, I'm going to say that the waters are muddied, and my previous panels have already spoken to this. The waters are heavily muddled by the prior policy changes bound up with access to the oral contraceptive pill. So in the economics literature, the big debate here is actually linked to the oral contraceptive pill. And this is also discussed, although no one ever mentions it, it's also discussed in the now famous Akerlof, Yellen, and Katz paper. So note, for instance, that using these gold standard techniques that I referred to, we do have a large set of leading economists who are going to tell you, and who have told you published in the leading journals, that access to the pill caused measurable improvements in women's life course outcomes. But for those women who did at that time and go on later to earn college and advanced degrees, and the children of well-educated parents. In other words, most of the things we understand as improvements in the lives of women since the late 60s and early 70s seem to be, in fact, causally linked to the pill and not perhaps to legal abortion, or at least, which is to say we don't know since those studies haven't been done. But worse, these improvements by any measure have been concentrated among higher socioeconomic class women. The women identified by William Julius Wilson in The Truly Disadvantaged, those highlighted by Charles Murray in Losing Ground, and the mothers of the kids described in Robert Putnam's Our Kids, these women and their children have not measurably improved. They do not seem to have experienced the kind of social mobility that I experienced, for instance, over my lifetime compared to my parents. And the benefits of the so-called contraceptive revolution seem not to have been equally distributed. And a good hunch, the hunch of our Akerlof, Yellen, and Katz, is that it may be that the same may be said for legalized abortion. Problematic indeed when those who have not shared equally in the so-called benefits are exactly those who were already in 1960 in more urgent need of assistance, such as single mothers who were 6 to 1 in 1960, 6 to 1, minority women already at that time, 6 to 1 in 1960. Perhaps, in fact, these reproductive technologies have widened the gap instead of closing it, so coming apart indeed. But again, to make these standards according to the make these arguments according to the gold standard have really not been done. So these are difficult questions. There are many good studies left to be done, and in fact, most of all, the good questions haven't been asked. There are very few social scientists available to tackle them. There are far more wonderful colleagues of mine working on these issues in the legal field, for instance, and even, I'm sorry, in the medical field, I know my medical professionals and friends who are in this room will disagree with me. They'll say there's not very many of us either. There are very few social scientists who can do these things. What I hope from today's exercise is to convince you that we need the beginning of a counter-revolution in social science, to borrow a phrase from F.A. Hayek. Yes, where social scientists are no longer called upon, in the words of Hannah Arendt, to pay service to the socially recognized function of protecting us from reality. Yep. The conservative movement, and now I have a challenge for my legal friends here, the conservative movement since Roe has primarily focused on policy reform. In the way that conservative legal scholars began to recognize about 20 years ago through the brilliance of Leonard Leo and the foundation of the Federalist Society, Conservatives need to start thinking about a completely different approach to the training and the academic legitimization of social scientists who do not toe the line on these things. This is the work we can do, and it's high time to start. Thank you.
I'm Janet Erickson, and it's such a privilege to be here with you and with these other presenters. And I feel like I'm coming home to the Heritage Foundation. I was a fellow here in 2004, and it's a gift to be here again with Jennifer Marshall and others. I am going to review just briefly some of what was discussed in the first panel and then go into more data about what specifically Roe has meant for relationships and what overturning it might mean. As has been quoted a couple of times here, the Casey decision makes this very interesting point, and I think it's powerful to think about, and so I'll reiterate it. For 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized their intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion. While the implication that we as women organize our lives around abortion's availability would come as a great surprise to us, to many of us, the statement recognizes that abortion on demand has influenced our perceptions of ourselves, as well as societal perceptions about women, our place in society, and how we organize and experience our intimate relationships. They were right in saying that, and that's what I'd like to tackle. How, in fact. First, Roe v. Wade and the Casey decision are based on the assumption that the capacity of women to act in society depends on altering and acting destructively toward our bodies, as Eric has insightfully explained. In our natural life-sustaining form, we are essentially defective men. The fact that women get pregnant and men do not means a dramatic sexual inequality. Abortion attempts to solve women's troubling natural inequality so that they, like men, can enter into sexual relations traditionally recognized as evidence of commitment and walk away with no commitment, autonomous, free to become socially and economically. But unlike men, as Eric explained, women must act affirmatively and destructively on our own bodies to imitate men. Though we are the enablers of life upon which everything else depends, we are assumed to live at the mercy of our own bodies, trapped by them, too weak, irrational, and incompetent to resist irresponsible men who impregnate us, and too politically weak to demand better conditions in the workplace. Consider what this has meant societally. Instead of shaping our educational institutions and places to accommodate the gift of women's fertility, we ignore it, consider it a liability, or at best a hobby to be pursued on one's individual time. As pro-life feminist Camille Williams argues, we require women to pay for children with lost opportunities for study or work, or to pay for their education and work by terminating their natural sustaining of life. As long as abortion is readily available, we ourselves and others will make the assumption that our dedication to education or career is judged by our willingness to abort rather than to interrupt our studies and our work. Women have been told, ironically, they must sacrifice life in order to have life. As Feminists for Life President Sarah Foster explains, in 1973, Roe v. Wade attorney Sarah Weddington exposed the discrimination and other injustices faced by pregnant women, but instead of seeking remedies for them, she demanded the right for women to submit to these injustices by destroying their pregnancies. In doing so, she masked rather than solved the challenges women, especially poor women, face. Abortion, ironically, prevents us from realizing reproductive justice and sexual equality because it refuses to acknowledge and respect the sexual difference between men and women. And it inherently undermines respect, protection, and support for the gift, the irreplaceable gift of women's childbearing capacity, even assuming it to be a defect. In Jean Elstein's powerful words, the argument is self-defeating. Behold the new woman as the old man. The second, what has Roe meant for our relationships, not only with ourselves, but with others? There's obviously, as recent reports state, including that coming out of Mike Lee's office, a complex relationship between the timing of widespread contraception use, access to abortion, and the dramatic increases in non-marital childbearing and decreased rates of marriage. It's complicated. People try to look at it according to when states, right, were forced to legalize abortion or not. What we do know is that the assumptions underlying abortion policy and widespread advocacy of contraception teach powerful messages about women's and men's relationships and their responsibilities to the life that they create. And those messages have negatively impacted women's ability to access what they most deeply desire, which I think shows up in what we know about the paradox of women's happiness actually declining on an international level over time, while men's has remained the same. I begin with Catherine Eden's remarkable exploration of the lives of low-income women, for whom she found a strong sense of relational poverty, far more powerful in its implications than physical poverty, in a sense. In the context of that relational poverty, consider how abortion on demand teaches that the relationships that we have are terminable at will, based upon convenience. Once a child is conceived, there is already a relationship with new life and with the father of that life. The question is, how will we treat that relationship? Abortion assumes that love, sacrifice, and commitment are contingent upon self-interest and fulfillment, a paradigm that is inherently alienating, as it encourages us to treat people as things and relationships as opportunities for profit. Abortion says not only to the woman, not only to the new life, but also to the woman, I will love and care for you when it works for me. In answer to the challenges of poverty, poor parenting, career impediments, and educational attainment, we are essentially told, if they are inconvenient, why don't you just abort them? As Professor David Smolin explains, and I think this is powerful, abortion rights are a type of disassociation right. Abortion itself constitutes a forceful separation of mother and child. Under the regime of autonomy, we are supposed to view disassociation rights as protective of rich associations. This does indeed represent an impoverished view of human relatedness, which reduces the human family and individual families within it to a collection of self-interested individuals. It is the definition of relational poverty. Specifically, consider how contraception and abortion have impacted women's and men's relationships. As sociologist Mark Regnerus explains, based on hundreds of interviews of young men and women, sex among singles used to occur in and during the search for someone to marry. The average woman could and did count on seeing evidence of commitment before sex because sex risked pregnancy, which would dramatically alter her life. But contraception and abortion, in his words, altered the playing field. Now having sex and thinking about or committing to marry are two very different things. Marriage is viewed as expensive and among lower classes nearly unattainable, while sex has become comparatively cheap. Men are now optimally positioned to navigate the marriage market in a way that privileges their sexual interests and preferences. This creates two overlapping but distinctive pools in the mating market, one for sex and one for marriage, with more men in the sex corner of the pool and more women in the marriage corner trying to secure commitment from men. In Baumeister's words, young men can now skip the wearing detour of getting education and career prospects to qualify for sex, nor does he have to get married and accept all the costs, including promising to share his lifetime earnings and forego other women forever. Female sex partners are available without all that. Sex has become free and easy. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge that men are just not simply in pursuit of sex. They are not quite that simple. But it's also important to recognize that there is a more complex pathway for him in committing to give himself fully than there is for a woman who gives life. This translates into lower levels of marriageable men, less commitment, and a more sexually permissive climate wherein women receive less in exchange for sex and are easily objectified. And then she bears responsibility for terminating the gift of life that may result. Her body, her choice, her problem. But in the rejection of her pregnancy, she is also being rejected, because to denigrate the gift of life unavoidably denigrates the person who carries that life. And there begins the irony of sexual liberation. The widespread availability of contraception and later abortion paralleled, ironically, dramatic increases in out-of-wedlock childbearing with significant negative implications for women and children. In 1960, the out-of-wedlock childbearing rate was 5%. Today is 41%, and among lower classes as high as 70%. The rate of marriage dramatically decreased, while the rate of cohabitation increased more than 17 times. But women, especially poor women, want the success sequence they see in upper-level women. They want it. But they continue to overwhelmingly desire marriage, though especially among these lower-income women, it has become incredibly fragile and rare. As Catherine Eden discovered, this relational poverty creates a compelling desire to give and receive love in the only way they know they have control over. The bond that children create is the most significant, if not only, enduring tie available. And these women do not appear to be far off in their assessment that strong binding relationships are the most powerful force for good. While middle-class observers often believe that the lives of poor women could be salvaged if not for the birth of their child, in Catherine Eden's experience, over and over again, mothers tell us their children put their lives back together. Listen to these quotes. "I'd have no direction if I hadn't had a child. There was no point to live for other than the next day getting high. Now I try to stay focused on what I want in my life for my kids. I look at my kids, I keep them in my head like they're telling me, 'Don't smoke, Mommy. Don't run away and have sex with him.' That's what I tell myself. Being a mother makes me feel like a whole other person. I have to do better." And in one African-American mother of 2 grown children and a 12-year-old remembers vividly how her mother wanted her to get a diploma first and live her life before having a child. But to me, she explains, that baby was life. Each elective abortion is some woman's pain. Every abortion is some kind of failure, not of contraceptives, but the failure of human beings to care for each other. For these women, advocacy for abortion only masks their deepest desire for connection and wholeness in relationships, with men as husbands and fathers and with the children of those fathers. We must work to create a world where we do not have to impoverish relationships, tear them apart, in order for women to have life. We can and must choose both. We must work to create a world where women do not have to settle for so much less than they yearn for in their relationships, because abortion has masked what it truly is they desire and need. A post-Roe world gives us the opportunity to effectively work toward that world.
Thanks. I'm Molly Hemingway. I'm very honored to be here with you, and I think it's such a wonderful topic to talk about life after Roe, by which we mean life after Roe and its superseding decisions with a fairly radical, even extreme abortion regime. In some sense, life after Roe would be very different. In another sense, it wouldn't be that different at all, not just because we have many states with laws that would be reverted to that would be very similar to the framework, but also because ultimately there's a cultural issue in play. The Solicitor General talking about how much more democratic engagement we would see in a post-Roe world is important. Talking about whether litigation or education or experience is the best way to change hearts and minds. All of these things hold together in how we communicate everything that we're talking about. And so the area that I focus on, which is our media, is very important for a post-Roe environment. There aren't actually many studies that look at the media. There used to be many more studies. We used to actually analyze the political views of many people in the media. It's frankly scandalous that we don't do it anymore, because the media like to present ourselves as people who are all about transparency and accountability. Those studies frequently showed such overwhelming bias that it's just embarrassing. As far as particular studies dealing with abortion, there really hasn't been anything as good as the landmark 1990 study done, of all places, at the Los Angeles Times by David Shaw, which spent a great deal of time, hundreds of interviews, 18 months, looking at how the media cover abortion. And what this person found, and I have no doubt that this guy who researched this was himself part of this group, but he saw that the language, the paradigm, and the polemic of how we talk about abortion completely advantaged the pro-abortion rights side and disadvantaged the anti-abortion pro-life side. That the events and issues that were covered were designed more toward favorable coverage of the pro-choice side. And you see that all the time. I mean, even recently, I think we had a pretty big story with, a couple years ago, you saw how the Komen Foundation, when it decided to stop subsidizing Planned Parenthood, there was a massive media-enabled campaign to fight back against that. And it was so obvious that the media were complicit with Planned Parenthood in doing this. A few months later, when the Kermit Gosnell story broke, which was obviously regardless of what your views are, this is a story that should be well covered. It's a serial murderer. It involves violation of women, particularly immigrant women. There was racial bias. There was drug abuse. There were health clinic concerns. You could have covered this from any number of angles, but the media actually had to be shamed into covering it. It took a great deal of work to get them to even mention it beyond a cursory level. When the grand jury report first came out, it did make a little splash. But then when the trial was going on and the years between the grand jury report and the trial, there was very little coverage and it had to be pushed to get out there. This study in 1990 also showed how prominent play was given to like pro-choice marches and not pro-life marches. You see that also, partly because of the way it's run. Pro-life marches happen all the time annually, whereas marches on the other side might have more distance between them, and they do involve a much greater deal of organization, but there is a disparity in how these things are covered. Columns, opinion 2-to-1 he found in favor of abortion rights. It's not something we have seen improve in the interim. And also he found that for people who claim to care about free speech or free association rights, when it was pro-lifers who were victimized or had their civil liberties violated, all of a sudden the media were much less interested in these things. So obviously, things have not gotten better since 1990. To some extent, they might have gotten worse. A lot of this is structural problems, partly dealing with the type of people who inhabit newsrooms. All come from very similar socioeconomic backgrounds. They have very similar political views. They even have similar, just have very similar demographics. And a lot of the people who control the debate and control what gets covered are just very similar, and there's not a lot of diversity there. I am senior editor of a publication called The Federalist, and one of the things that we cared about a great deal was getting more women, and more women who aren't in that clique that are in every newsroom, to have our voices included so that we could tell stories that were different from what you hear everywhere else. And that's not just in telling our stories, it's also in how we report, opinion pieces, and the like. So someone mentioned earlier the Speak Your Abortion campaign, which is about legitimizing that experience or somehow making it seem a better thing than what a lot of us know it is. We work on also talking about these stories. We published people who talk about their abortion and the downsides of that, or how it affected them, and how it isn't the unalloyed good that you hear in many media presentations. About women who were in very difficult circumstances and chose differently than the way the world would have them choose, believing that the only value they have is if their womb is empty. Also just telling other stories just related to women's fertility. I mean, there's not a lot of good stuff happening there, and there are so many issues that relate to the culture of life that need to be told. So we have women talking about difficulties that they've experienced with miscarriage, the problems with infertility and barrenness, and having just many stories so women can understand that they're not alone in these battles. Just a more nuanced discussion of contraception and its role, surrogacy, and technological issues, which I think people haven't thought through as much as they should. Just in general, the idea that being a woman is a gift that doesn't need to be conquered but should be valued, which is very different than so much of what we're told about women needing to be just like men in order to have value in our society. I think it's also important that we engage the arts. Partly that can be done through media criticism. One of the things that was interesting to watch that happened in recent years is Planned Parenthood and other abortion rights groups have really pushed to include abortion stories in the arts. There's a reason why it hasn't gone over terribly well. just not a great way to have stories. There was a movie that was actually co-written by Planned Parenthood called Obvious Child. It didn't do well at the box office, but just engaging and talking about why those stories don't do well, or why they push for network television to include it, how it fails. But also pulling out pro-life streams in storytelling, which happen everywhere and all the time. A movie came out a couple years ago that I only just recently saw, starring Amy Adams, called Arrival, which had so many fascinating pro-life themes throughout. It wasn't like a pro-life movie, it's certainly not intending to be that kind of thing, but being able to pull things out so people know how to interpret art and have a approach to this larger story. And on which note, I think it's very important that we elevate our great storytellers and stories that are related to this. There are such wonderful stories. I saw Catherine Zeltner here earlier, who does such a good job with her broadcast show weekly, telling stories of life and its beauty. Kelsey Harkness is an amazing broadcast journalist who works here at the Daily Signal in this building, who has done such a good job. She recently had a story about a woman who was pregnant, unmarried, not in a great situation, and how she came to give birth to her son and then the family that adopted him, and being able to look at that whole story beginning to end. And it wasn't like some Pollyanna-ish, everything is great here kind of story. It was complicated, and it was just serious and took the issue seriously. These are things to highlight. And the other thing that I think is really important is coming at this issue from all sorts of different angles. One of my favorite pieces that we published at The Federalist was by a young writer named Tristan Bloom, which was built out of a speech she gave at a pro-life conference, and it was called something like The Surprising Ingredient to Pro-Life Culture, or something like that. And one of the things she talked about, which was so different for me as an older lady to see what a millennial says about these things, she was saying that so often millennials are treated as if they are irresponsible. And in fact, a big problem for the culture of life is that they're too responsible, and they believe that having something like a pregnancy happen outside of marriage is just something that destroys all of your life plans, and you think that you need to have such schedule and rigor and plannedness to everything you do. In fact, life is unpredictable, and it involves risk, and there are all sorts of things that we should not value that we do, like the lack of risk or the lack of security or how perfect it is to have everything perfectly planned. And it was just such a fresh and interesting take, and it's related to the issue that we're talking about, but it's really so much bigger and about the importance of people having just a complete ethic that is different than the dominant paradigm that we see and that is pushed on us in every media outlet and in the culture and in Hollywood. So I just want to also make a plea that we all understand that we have understanding here, and it's important to share it with other people. It's a gift to give to other people. Not everybody has this knowledge or this perspective or this support. And if you have these stories, it's important to tell them. Hit me up or hit someone else up who can publish them if you have talents in terms of video and otherwise. So regardless of what the law is, and it's very important what the law is, the cultural issues are extremely important, and we need to make sure that we keep building up that culture for the long term.
Thank you to our panelists, Catherine, Janet, and Molly. Please feel free to remain there for a few moments if you don't mind. I would now like to welcome Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers, today's keynote speaker. Not only is she the longest serving woman in Republican leadership and the fourth highest ranking Republican in the House, Representative McMorris Rogers is chair of the House Republican Conference and was instrumental in bringing pain-capable Unborn Child Protection Act to passage in the House. Please join me in welcoming Representative McMorris Rogers.
Very good. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, AUL, for hosting us today. Together, we are reaffirming that all life is worth protecting, that all life is sacred, and that everyone, including women and the unborn, deserves their God-given opportunity to reach their full potential. I'm grateful for your efforts, especially as this Congress, along with President Trump, has led on a number of pro-life priorities. Just to name a few, the House passed the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Act and the Pain-Capable Unborn Children Protection Act. The Hyde Amendment is now permanent. We've appointed a pro-life justice to the Supreme Court. And the administration just recently announced the Protect Life rule to stop Title X funding, family funding, from going to abortion providers. These are important wins that have put us one step closer to protecting all lives. During the March for Life this year, I encouraged everyone to reach out and find ways that they could be a friend and be a friend on behalf of the pro-life community, to share stories of love and human value. I didn't know that just a few weeks later I'd be challenged to take my own advice. Ruth Marcus with the Washington Post published an op-ed that said women needed a right to abort children with Down syndrome. And she wrote, quote, "I would have terminated those pregnancies had the testing come back positive. I would have grieved the loss and moved on." I was shocked and offended. And so I shared my story. I'm a pro-life mom of 3. I see huge potential in all of my kids, Cole, Grace, and Bryn. Cole's my oldest, and he was born with that extra 21st chromosome. When my husband and I received the news that he had Down syndrome, it wasn't what we expected. It was tough news to hear. And we were given a long list of challenges and chances of heartache. Well, today, Cole is living a life full of huge potential. He is in 5th grade. He loves to learn. He loves basketball. He's a great big brother. So my message to Ruth was this: just because something is hard doesn't mean that it's not positive. Cole's made me a better legislator, and he's given me a whole new purpose and passion to be an ability advocate. I am empowered because of Cole and my 2 daughters too. I believe it's stories like mine that will pave the way for us to overturn Roe v. Wade. It's not lost on me that it takes courage to share these stories. I remember the Doritos commercial that pro-abortion groups called controversial because it featured an animated baby on an ultrasound machine. A provision in the tax reform bill would have allowed parents to open college savings accounts for their unborn children. It was called dangerous. And because we're pro-life, many are quick to call us anti-woman. So what do all of these examples have in common? It's the rhetoric that shuts down the debate about the humanity of the unborn. And is further dividing us by creating this culture of us versus them. And really, an us versus them mentality on what it means to empower women. So how exactly do we break through and use our pro-life platform to bring Americans together? I believe that the answer involves going outside of our comfort zones and identifying what ties us together as Americans. Over the last year, I have been hosting a series of unity dinners in my district. And the purpose of these unity dinners is to bring people together to build trust and to bring our community closer together, even when we may disagree on some really big issues. Through these unity dinners, I've been reminded that everyone has a story. There are stories of hope and love. There are stories of pain and deep heartache. Every story is a chance to bring us closer together, to develop a stronger understanding. And I believe that it marks an opportunity for all of us. And I encourage all of us to work hard, telling our stories, stories of new moms, stories of medical miracles, stories of children with disabilities who are making lasting contributions on this world. I also challenge you to find ways to reach out to those who aren't friends of the pro-life movement. Lead by example. Think about how you can foster welcoming and courageous conversations. The stories you share have the power to make change, so that we become a culture that values life. That's how we will identify the common ground that unites us and allows us to change hearts and minds on Roe v. Wade. I'm hopeful, encouraged that we will succeed, and it really is on all of us. The shortest distance between two people is their story. And this year, it was Arthur Brooks from AEI that challenged me to write my story in 10 words. Mine are pioneer, 5th generation in the Pacific Northwest. Both sides of my family came out on the Oregon Trail. Trailblazer, first in my family to graduate from college. The 200th woman ever elected to serve in the United States House of Representatives. Wife. That's significant when you're 35 and single when you're elected to Congress. Working mom of 3. I told you about Cole, Grace, and Bryn. Ability advocate. That means advocating for the potential and the value of every person. And trust builder. Each of my 10 words resonate with people differently. I find that some resonate being a working mom. Others focus on being a trust builder. And that's why I believe that we as conservatives can have the moral high ground, because we believe in the dignity of every person. We see abilities, not disabilities. We focus on their potential, not victimhood. We see a future full of choices and opportunities waiting to be seized. And that's why the left's version of the women's movement does an injustice to women. They focus on reproductive rights and women's status as victims, almost solely, and they send a message that women's opportunities are tied directly to their option to have an abortion. Again, they're creating that us versus them mentality. And that's why programs like today are so important. Women Speak. It's so aptly titled, because when women speak, we realize that our education, our careers, our relationships, our families are complicated. Most of us don't spend our days thinking about our lives in the terms of reproductive rights. We care about finances, security, healthcare, and everything in between. And as conservatives, we know that conservative policy empowers all people, men and women of all kinds. I just wanted to highlight tax reform, and that as a most recent example. One of the untold stories of tax reform is how it is benefiting women. We expanded the child tax credit. We preserved the adoption tax credit. We expanded 529 accounts. For moms like me, raising a child with disability, my ABLE 2.0 provisions will allow an individual with disabilities to go explore work and reach their God-given potential. In addition, because of tax reform, we hear many companies that are investing and expanding their family leave policies. We're building a stronger economy that means more freedom, more opportunity for everyone in this country. That's something we can all celebrate. Speaking for Women is about empowering us at every stage of our life. I see so many unique women with equally unique stories in this room that are ready to change the cultural narrative. I challenge you to join me. Tell your story. Write down those 10 words. My advice to you is don't be afraid to be bold, live courageously, and be a positive disruptor. Together, we can build a brighter future for everyone, from the moment of conception to beyond. Thank you very much. God bless you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to Representative McMorris Rogers for her time and her very inspiring comments. Thank you to all of you who joined us today, whether here in the room or electronically on the web. We appreciate you as well. We hope that you enjoyed this inaugural Women Speak 2018, and we look forward to seeing you next year. And for those of us who are here in the room, we invite you to join us now for lunch. Please feel free to step outside into the lobby area and collect your lunches, and then we'll proceed to the rooftop to continue the discussion there. Thank you.
So all those things, they were texting me to not go, but I just had it down so I didn't actually see it. They're like, just hold up, wait. But I'm actually glad we just got everything done. Yeah. Because they were going to have you wait. Yeah. Which is, no, but I feel bad that I didn't see it until the end, and I was like, oh.
But how are you going to see it?
Right, so. Yes.
Music
Thank you.
to the Jim Morrison, each of us share the same nutrients. Set mind got laced with divine DNA, gon' face it. The child of a freedom fighter, trial like graffiti writers, wild like the freedom riders. We are all day walkers, hybrids, bilingual, bicultural, blowing in a king's tongue. Elohim and human one, Rosetta Stone with a mic and some chucks on. All things to all men, say all men. Were you the product of a panther and mama's prayers answered? You don't even think twice. Be like, let's go. Let's go. Let's go. They ask you about the culture. Say what? Say I know it well. I know it well. I know it well. Yes, sir. I know it well. I know it well. Hey, holla at him, Craig. You got it, bro. Yeah.
Hey, look, my homies told me back when I was playing my Nintendo to stay away from windows, cause bullets, they tend to hit those. My mama told me when I got the PS1 to skip the BS and lead us to BS numb. As every other brother throwing up colors in my community. I knew better, but couldn't do better. But then I grew to be the same dude, reading Wayne Grudem, even though I grew up listening to Snoop and Ice Cube. Be amused at the music, we use that to bruise cats' egos. Nowadays you might find me under the steeple, preaching to the people, or making me a sequel to mixtapes, get shin scrapes and skate parks. I'm everything in one, I'm the product of great art. I'm the product of Descartes, Tim Keller and Outkast. Iconoclast, the glass ceiling that they put above me. The reason that they hate me, the same reason they love me.
Were you the product of a panther and mama's prayers